The morning Mara Holloway's life changed forever started like any other kind of hell. She woke to the sound of boots on her porch, heavy, deliberate, the kind that didn't bother with politeness. Through the gaps in the cabin's warped boards, sunlight fell in thin strips across her bed, illuminating dust that hung in the air like accusations. Her hands found the wheels of her chair before her eyes fully opened. Muscle memory, survival instinct. The same routine she'd performed every morning for the past 9 months, since the wagon accident that had stolen her legs and, apparently, her value to the world. Miss Holloway? The voice outside was male, unfamiliar, and carried the flat tone of someone delivering bad news professionally. Need a word. Mara didn't answer immediately. She transferred herself from bed to chair with practiced efficiency, ignoring the burn in her shoulders, the persistent ache in her lower back that never quite left anymore. Her hands were calloused now, in places they'd never been before, across the palms, along the base of each finger. Teacher's hands once, soft from chalk dust and paper. Now they looked like they belonged to someone who'd been fighting for a long time. She rolled to the door and opened it just wide enough to see 3 men standing in her yard. The sun behind them turned their faces into shadows, but their postures told her everything. Collection agents. She'd seen enough of them lately to recognize the stance, weight shifted back, hands loose at their sides, expressions carefully neutral. They weren't here to hurt her. They were here to take things. Miss Holloway, the middle one said again. He was younger than the others, probably thought that made him seem less threatening. I'm Benjamin Porter, representing the Red Hollow Credit Exchange. We've sent notices. I got them. Then you know we're here about the outstanding debts on this property. He pulled a paper from his jacket, unfolding it with practiced care. Medical expenses from Dr. Halloran, supply account at Brennan's store, emergency loan from the Territorial Bank. Total sum of $247, plus accumulated interest. I know what I owe. Mara's voice came out harder than she intended. 9 months ago, she would have been apologetic, embarrassed, would have offered these men water, maybe biscuits if she had any, would have explained herself as if poverty required an explanation. I'm working on it. Porter's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. Pity. She hated that look more than contempt. Ma'am, the town council's been patient, more patient than they needed to be considering, but without any real income coming in, and with the school position filled by Miss Carson now. The school position was mine, was being the relevant word. The man to Porter's left spoke up, older with a face like weathered leather. Town needed a teacher who could stand at the front of a classroom, Miss Holloway. No offense intended, but facts are facts. Mara's hands tightened on her wheels. She wanted to argue, to point out that she'd been teaching Red Hollow's children since she was 23, that she knew every family in this valley, that a chair didn't make her less capable of conjugating verbs or teaching long division. But she'd had this argument before, in front of the council, in front of parents who suddenly couldn't meet her eyes. She'd lost then. Words wouldn't change anything now. How long? She asked. Porter glanced at the paper. We're authorized to take possession of the property in 72 hours unless the debt is settled in full. 72 hours. 3 days to find nearly $300 in a town where most families survived on $50 a year. Mara felt something cold settle in her chest. Not panic, not yet. Just a kind of numb recognition. This was how it ended. Not dramatically, not with any dignity or fight. Just a quiet removal, a foreclosure notice. Another name forgotten by a town that had already moved on. I understand, she said, and started to close the door. Miss Holloway. Porter's boot stopped the door from shutting. He looked genuinely uncomfortable now. If you have family, anyone who might... I don't. Friends, then. Someone who could... Thank you for the notice, Mr. Porter. Mara pulled the door firmly shut, then sat very still in the darkness of her cabin, listening to the men's boots retreat across the dry earth outside. Through the window, she could see the spring, the only spring within 20 miles that hadn't dried up in the 3-year drought that had been slowly killing this valley. Water bubbled up from somewhere deep underground, creating a small pool surrounded by green grass that looked almost obscene against the brown desolation everywhere else. Her father had built this cabin beside that spring 40 years ago, back when Red Hollow had been nothing but a survey marker and a dream. He died here. Her mother, too. And Mara had always figured she would as well, eventually. Just not this soon. Not like this. She rolled to her small desk, really just a board laid across 2 stacks of crates, and pulled out the letter she'd been avoiding for 2 weeks. The handwriting was precise, official. Dear Miss Holloway, while we acknowledge your previous contributions to the educational development of Red Hollow, the school board has determined that physical presence and mobility are essential requirements for the position of primary instructor. They'd paid her through the end of the previous term, given her a month's severance, which she'd immediately spent on doctors who couldn't help and medicine that didn't work. Then they'd hired Sarah Carson, a young woman from Denver with proper credentials, and more importantly, 2 working legs. Sarah was perfectly nice, perfectly competent, perfectly everything Mara no longer was. The children had cried when Mara left. That was something, at least. She was still sitting there, staring at nothing, when she heard the horse. Not horses, plural, like the collection agents had ridden. Just one, moving slow and deliberate down the road that passed in front of her property. Mara rolled to the window and pulled back the thin curtain. The rider was tall enough that she noticed it even from a distance, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to suggest either hard labor or harder living. He wore dark clothes and a hat pulled low, and he rode like someone who'd spent more time in a saddle than out of one. As he drew closer, Mara could see more details. Face weathered by sun and wind, somewhere between 35 and 50, the kind of age the frontier carved into people, making them simultaneously younger and older than they should be. Dark hair, dark eyes. A rifle in a scabbard on his saddle, a revolver at his hip. Not unusual for this territory, but the way he wore them suggested they weren't just for show. He didn't ride past. He stopped directly in front of her cabin, studying the spring with the kind of attention people usually reserve for things they intended to take. Mara rolled back from the window. Strange men showing interest in her water wasn't new. She'd had 3 different ranchers try to negotiate access in the past year alone, but something about this one set her nerves on edge. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way he sat his horse, perfectly still, like a man who'd learned to wait out any situation. The knock when it came was firm but not aggressive. Mara considered not answering, considered pretending she wasn't home. But the man had clearly seen her at the window, and besides, hiding from problems had stopped being an option about the same time her legs stopped working. She opened the door. Up close, the stranger was even more imposing. Not just tall, but built solid, with the kind of presence that seemed to take up more space than his actual body occupied. His face was all hard angles, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that had been broken at least once. His eyes were the color of winter rivers, gray-blue and cold. He looked at her without any of the usual reactions. No surprise at the chair, no pity, no uncomfortable averting of gaze. He just looked at her the same way he'd looked at the spring, assessing Miss Holloway. His voice matched everything else about him, low, rough, economical with words. That's right, and you are? Rhett Mercer. He didn't offer his hand, which she appreciated. Men always offered to shake, then looked awkward when they realized they had to bend down. Mind if I water my horse? It was a courtesy question. He could have just done it without asking, and they both knew it. But Mara nodded anyway. Go ahead. She watched as Mercer led his horse to the spring, let it drink its fill. He moved with deliberate care, no wasted motion. A man comfortable with silence and his own company. When the horse was satisfied, he stood there for a moment looking at the water, then at her cabin, then at the dry hills surrounding them. You're the schoolteacher, he said. Was. Heard about the accident, heard the town let you go. Mara's jaw tightened. News travels. Always does. Mercer turned to face her fully. Also heard you're 3 days from losing this place. That news traveled fast. Porter talks, especially after a few drinks. Mercer's expression didn't change, but something in his tone suggested he found Porter's indiscretion useful. $247? It wasn't a question, but Mara answered anyway. Plus interest. You have it? Would I be 3 days from foreclosure if I did? The corner of Mercer's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, just acknowledgement of a fair point. Suppose not. He was quiet for a moment, still watching her with those cold, assessing eyes. I could help with that. Mara felt something tighten in her chest. Here it came. The offer that seemed generous on the surface but came with hooks underneath. She'd heard versions of it before, from Thomas Brennan at the general store, who'd suggested she could work off her debt in ways he'd left carefully vague. From Samuel Vance, who owned half the valley and wanted access to her spring badly enough to propose a partnership that would have left her with nothing. From well-meaning church women who clucked their tongues and suggested she might be happier in a charity home back east. somewhere she could be properly cared for. Boss sucked. I'm not interested in charity, she said. Good, because I'm not offering any. Mercer walked back toward her porch, stopping a respectful distance away. I'm offering a business arrangement. What kind of arrangement? The kind where I pay off your debts and you give me something in return. Mara's hands tightened on her wheels. I don't have anything worth that kind of money, Mr. Mercer. You have this land, this spring. There it was. The real reason a stranger had ridden up to her door asking careful questions. Mara felt something bitter rise in her throat. The spring isn't for sale. I'm not asking to buy it. Mercer's eyes hadn't left her face. I'm asking to marry you for it. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Mara almost laughed. Almost. But Mercer's expression remained perfectly serious, perfectly calm, like he'd just proposed the most reasonable business transaction in the world. You... what? Marriage. Mercer said the word like it was a contract clause, not a sacrament. Legal and binding. I pay your debts, get access to the spring and the land. You keep your home, keep your independence. We live separate lives unless necessity requires otherwise. Mara stared at him, trying to find the angle, the trap. Men didn't just ride up and propose marriage to crippled women out of business interest. There had to be something else. Why? She asked. Does it matter? It does if I'm supposed to believe this is a legitimate offer and not some scheme to steal my property the second I'm stupid enough to sign something. Mercer was quiet for a long moment, and Mara had the distinct impression he was deciding how much truth to give her. I need water rights, he said finally. Legal, uncontestable water rights. Marriage gives me that. Gives you financial security and protection. Protection from what? From men less honest than me who want this spring just as badly. It should have sounded arrogant, that claim of honesty from a man who just admitted he wanted to marry her for property rights. But something in the flat, matter-of-fact way he said it made Mara think he actually believed it. That in his particular moral economy, stating your self-interest clearly was a form of honor. This is insane, she said. It's practical. It's a trap. It's a choice. Mercer's eyes held hers. You can say no. Let the bank take this place in 3 days. Move to whatever charity arrangement people have lined up for the poor cripple who used to teach their children. Or you can say yes, keep your home, and deal with a husband who will leave you alone except when absolutely necessary. The words stung, partly because they were deliberately cruel, partly because they were absolutely true. Mara had heard the conversations, the whispered plans. The town's women were already organizing to send her east, to some charitable institution where she could live out her days doing light sewing or some other suitably sedentary occupation for the unfortunate. A living burial. I need time to think, she said. You have until sundown tomorrow. Mercer walked back to his horse, swung up into the saddle with easy grace. After that, I'm riding out. You'll have your foreclosure, and I'll find water somewhere else. Where are you staying? Hotel in town. He touched the brim of his hat, the first gesture toward conventional courtesy he'd made. Think carefully, Miss Holloway. Pride's a luxury. This land isn't. He rode away without waiting for a response, leaving Mara alone on her porch with an impossible decision and less than 24 hours to make it. So, that night, Mara didn't sleep. She rolled around her small cabin, touching things, the desk where she'd graded papers by lamplight, the shelf holding her father's few books, the cast-iron stove that had heated 1,000 simple meals. Every object felt weighted with memory, with the accumulated evidence of a life lived in one place. Losing this cabin wouldn't just mean losing shelter. It would mean losing the last physical proof that she'd existed here, that she'd mattered. But marriage to a stranger? Mara had never been particularly romantic. Frontier life didn't encourage it. She'd seen enough marriages of convenience, enough practical arrangements between people who needed each other's labor more than their love. But those couples had known each other at least, had shared meals at church socials, danced at barn raisings, built toward partnership even if passion never entered the equation. Rhett Mercer was a complete unknown. Dangerous, clearly. Comfortable with violence, given the way he wore those weapons. He'd shown up in Red Hollow with suspicious timing and suspiciously specific knowledge of her situation. Men didn't just stumble across drowning women and offer life preservers. They researched. They planned. Which meant Mercer had been planning this. The question was why. Mara rolled to her desk and lit the lamp, pulling out paper and pencil. Her father had taught her to work through problems by writing them down. Assets on one side, liabilities on the other. Simple arithmetic for complicated decisions. If I say no, lose the cabin in 3 days, lose the land, the spring, everything. Accept charity from the town, at best. Live somewhere else, dependent on others. No income, no prospects, no future. If I say yes, keep the cabin. Well, keep the land, legally at least. Avoid charity, maintain some independence. Marry a stranger who might be dangerous. Give up any hope of real marriage, family, normal life. Live with someone I don't trust and can't control. When she put it like that, both options looked terrible. One guaranteed loss, the other possible catastrophe. But Mara had learned something in 9 months of rehabilitation, of forcing her body to do things it insisted were impossible. Catastrophe you could fight. Loss you just had to accept. She'd be damned if she went quietly into acceptance. Around midnight, she heard horses outside again. Several this time, moving fast. Mara rolled to the window and saw 4 riders silhouetted against the moonlight, circling her property like wolves around a wounded deer. They didn't approach the cabin, just rode the perimeter, their message clear. We're watching, we're waiting, and when this place becomes available, we'll be first in line. By dawn, Mara had made her decision. She dressed carefully, not her everyday calico, but the good blue dress she'd worn to church before the accident, when she'd still gone to church. Fixed her hair, which had gotten long and unkempt in recent months. She looked at herself in the small mirror above her wash basin and saw someone she barely recognized. Thinner, harder, older than 37, had any right to look, but alive. Still alive. She rolled out to the porch just as the sun broke over the eastern hills, painting Red Hollow in shades of gold and amber that almost made the drought-stricken valley look beautiful. In better times, her students would be waking up now, getting ready for school. She wondered if they thought about her anymore, or if Sarah Carson had already replaced her in their memories the way she'd replaced her in the classroom. Mara was still sitting there when she saw Mercer riding back up the road, right on time. He sat his horse the same way as yesterday, patient, certain, like a man who'd never doubted what her answer would be. She hated that he was right. He dismounted, walked to the base of her porch steps, didn't speak, just waited. I have conditions, Mara said. Something flickered across Mercer's face, not quite surprise, not quite respect. I'm listening. The cabin stays mine. If this arrangement ends for any reason, I keep the land and the spring. No legal challenges. Agreed. I want that in writing, drawn up by a lawyer, not some handshake deal. We'll go to Thompson in town this morning. Mara took a breath. And I want to know why you're really doing this. Not the water rights story, the truth. Mercer was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of its earlier clinical detachment. There's a group of men trying to buy up all the water rights in this valley. Wealthy men from back east who think they can turn frontier survival into profit. They're using legal pressure, intimidation, violence when necessary. Once they control the water, they control everything. Who farms, who ranches, who even gets to live here. And you're trying to stop them? I'm trying to take back something they stole from me. Mercer's jaw tightened, the first real emotion she'd seen from him. My family's ranch, 5 years ago. They forced my father into bankruptcy, took the land, used our water rights to leverage control over 3 neighboring properties. By the time I got back from working cattle drives up north, my father was dead, and the ranch belonged to a holding company that didn't even have a real name. So this is revenge. This is justice. Mercer met her eyes. Your spring connects to an underground river system that runs through half this valley. I've seen the geological surveys. Whoever controls this land controls access to that system. I marry you. I get legal standing to fight for those water rights. I win that fight. I can reclaim my father's ranch and break their hold on Red Hollow. It was the longest speech she'd heard from him, and the honesty in it felt almost dangerous, like he'd revealed more than he'd intended. Mara sat very still, processing. So, I'm not a wife, she said. I'm a weapon. You're a partner with different assets than me. Mercer stepped closer to the porch, looking up at her with those Winter River eyes. I won't lie to you, Miss Holloway. I won't pretend this is romance or rescue, but I will keep my word. You'll have your home, your independence, and my protection against anyone who tries to take either from you. That's more than most marriages offer. He was right, and Mara hated it, but hatred didn't change arithmetic. One more condition, she said. I want to teach again. Not in the town school, I know that's gone, but there are families scattered through this valley whose children can't make the ride to Red Hollow. I want to teach them. Here at the cabin, or wherever they can come. Mercer considered this. That would actually help. Give us a reason for people to visit this property regularly. Make it harder for anyone to claim we're not actively using the land. I'm not doing it for strategic reasons. I'm doing it because teaching is who I am. Doesn't matter why, as long as it gets done. Mercer held out his hand, this time not for a shake, but to help her down from the porch. We have an agreement, then? Mara looked at his hand, scarred knuckles, calluses that matched her own new ones, strong enough to hurt if he chose, but also steady, reliable in its strength. She took it. We have an agreement, Mr. Mercer. Rhett, he said, pulling her chair down the steps with surprising care. If we're getting married, you should probably use my first name. Rhett, Mara repeated, and the name felt strange in her mouth. Foreign, like a word from a language she'd never learned to speak. They rode into Red Hollow together, Mara's chair secured in a small wagon Rhett had apparently brought with him. The town wasn't large, one main street with a general store, hotel, saloon, bank, and a handful of other businesses. But news traveled fast in small places, and by the time they reached the lawyer's office, Mara could feel eyes watching from every window, could practically hear the gossip sparking like wildfire. Did you see? The cripple and that drifter. Going to Thompson's office. You don't think... Thompson himself was a small, nervous man who looked perpetually worried that someone was about to sue him. He brightened considerably when Rhett produced a thick envelope of cash, payment for drawing up the marriage contract with Mara's conditions. Most unusual, Thompson muttered as he wrote, his pen scratching across the paper. Separate property clauses, reversion rights, stipulations about land use. This reads more like a business incorporation than a marriage license. That's exactly what it is, Mara said. Thompson glanced up at her, then at Rhett, then very quickly back at his paper. Well, it's your prerogative, of course, though I should mention that such arrangements can be challenged in court if the marriage appears to be fraudulent. It won't be fraudulent, Rhett cut in, his voice flat. We'll be legally married. We'll live on the same property. That's sufficient for territorial law. Yes, of course. Thompson signed the document with a flourish, then pushed it across the desk. You'll need witnesses for the ceremony itself. I can provide those if you're planning to proceed today. Mara and Rhett looked at each other. They hadn't discussed timing, but there didn't seem to be any point in waiting. Porter and his collection agents would be back in less than 48 hours. Better to have the marriage done, the debts paid, before anyone could interfere. Today, Mara said. Thompson nodded and called in his clerk and secretary to witness. The ceremony itself took less than 5 minutes, Thompson reciting the legal formula in a bored monotone, Rhett and Mara speaking their required agreements, signatures on paper that would change everything. When it was done, Mara looked down at her left hand, now wearing a simple gold band that Rhett had produced from his pocket. It fit perfectly, which meant he'd somehow known her ring size. More planning, more evidence of how thoroughly he'd researched this trap he'd sprung on her. Except she'd walked into it willingly. That was the part that made her chest feel tight. They left Thompson's office as husband and wife, and Mara realized she felt exactly the same as she had an hour before. No different. No more married, just legally bound to a stranger who needed her land. Their next stop was the bank, where Rhett paid off her debts in full. Cash on the barrel, enough to make the bank manager's eyebrows climb toward his hairline. Then to Brennan's store, settling her supply account. Then to the doctor's office, closing out medical bills. By noon, Mara Holloway, now Mara Mercer, though the name still felt like someone else's, was free of debt for the first time in 9 months. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt like she'd traded one kind of owing for another, and this new debt didn't have a clear price. Your things, Rhett said as they prepared to leave town. You'll need to pack. We're moving to my place. Mara's stomach dropped. I thought I was keeping the cabin. You are. Legally, it's yours. But we can't live separately. Too easy for someone to claim the marriage is a sham. We live together at my ranch, maintain the cabin as a second property. He must have seen something in her face because his voice softened slightly. It's not far, 5 miles north. You can visit the cabin whenever you want, use it for your teaching. And your ranch? What's it like? Functional, Rhett said, which told her exactly nothing. They rode back to the cabin in silence, and Mara spent the journey trying not to think about what she'd just done. Married a stranger, agreed to leave her home, tied her survival to a man whose true motives she still didn't fully understand. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was starting its descent toward the western hills. Mara packed quickly: clothes, books, her father's pocket watch, the few possessions that mattered. Rhett loaded everything into the wagon without comment, his movements efficient and impersonal. She took one last look at the cabin before they left. It looked smaller than she remembered, more fragile. Or maybe she was just seeing it through different eyes now, the eyes of someone who'd lost and reclaimed it in the same breath. "Ready?" Rhett asked. Mara wasn't sure she'd ever be ready, but she nodded anyway. They rode north as the sun set, painting the valley in shades of blood and gold, and Mara watched her old life disappear behind her with every turn of the wagon wheels. Ahead lay Rhett Mercer's ranch, his secrets, his war with wealthy men who saw the frontier as something to be conquered and controlled. And somewhere in that future, Mara would have to figure out who she was now. Not the woman who'd lost everything, not the teacher the town had forgotten. Someone new. Someone harder. Someone who'd said yes when every instinct had screamed to refuse, because survival mattered more than pride, and sometimes the wrong choice was the only choice left. The ranch appeared as darkness fell, a low-slung house surrounded by empty corrals and fields that should have held cattle but didn't. It looked abandoned, half dead, like everything else in this drought-starved valley. Rhett helped her down from the wagon, carried her chair to the porch without being asked. "I'll get your things," he said, then paused. "There's a room on the main floor, south side, gets good light. I figure you'd want that." He'd already thought about it, already planned for her limitations, her needs. Mara didn't know whether to be grateful or unnerved. "Thank you," she said, and meant it. She rolled into what was now her home, into a marriage that wasn't a marriage, into a future built on secrets and water and desperation. Behind her, Rhett unloaded her life from the wagon, and somewhere in the darkness, Red Hollow settled into another drought-starved night, unaware that the balance of power in the valley had just shifted. Mara sat in her new room, in her new prison, in her new chance, and wondered which of those three things would define what came next. Only time would tell. And in Red Hollow, time was the one thing nobody had enough of. The first week of marriage passed in a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of violence. Rhett left before dawn each morning, returning only after dark, covered in dust and smelling of horse sweat and something metallic that Mara eventually recognized as gun oil. He barely spoke except to confirm she had what she needed: water, food, firewood. Their conversations were transactional, stripped of anything resembling intimacy or even basic human warmth. "You need anything from town?" "No." "There's venison in the cold box. Should last a few days." "Fine. I'll be gone tomorrow. Back by nightfall." "Understood." It was exactly what he'd promised: a marriage in name only, separate lives under one roof. Mara told herself this was what she wanted, what she'd agreed to. But the loneliness of it hit harder than she'd expected, settling into her bones like the autumn cold that was starting to creep through the valley. The ranch house itself was bigger than her cabin, but just as sparse. 4 rooms, kitchen, sitting area, 2 bedrooms. The furniture was functional but worn, the kind that had been used hard and maintained poorly. No curtains on the windows, no rugs on the floors, nothing decorative or soft. A man's space, built for survival rather than living. Mara spent those first days exploring her new prison, mapping the distances between rooms, learning which floorboards creaked and which doorways were wide enough for her chair to pass through easily. The bedroom Rhett had given her was indeed on the south side, with windows that caught the morning sun. He'd cleared it completely before she arrived. No furniture except a bed, a washstand, and a sturdy table he'd apparently built specifically for her to use as a desk. The consideration in that gesture unsettled her more than indifference would have. On the 8th day, she woke to find Rhett hadn't left at dawn. Instead, he was outside her window, building something. The sound of hammer on wood pulled her from sleep, and she rolled to the window to see him constructing a ramp from her bedroom door to the ground. Not a temporary solution, but a proper structure, carefully measured and solidly built. She watched him work for 20 minutes before rolling outside. The morning air was cold enough to see her breath, and she'd wrapped a shawl around her shoulders against the chill. "You don't have to do that," she said. Rhett didn't stop hammering. "Door's got a 6-inch step. You shouldn't have to wait for me to lift your chair every time you want to go outside." "I've managed steps before. Not saying you can't. Saying you shouldn't have to." He drove another nail home with 3 precise strikes, then stood back to check the angle. "This way you can come and go as you please. More independent." There was that word again, independent. He'd used it in his proposal, in the contract negotiations, as if it were currency he was trading for access to her land. But watching him build this ramp with his own hands, taking measurements twice to get the slope exactly right, Mara wasn't sure what to make of it. "Why are you being kind?" The question came out more confrontational than she'd intended. Rhett looked at her then, and his expression was difficult to read. "This isn't kindness. It's maintenance. You're my wife now, at least on paper. People will judge my character by how I treat you. Man who mistreats a woman in a chair isn't just cruel. He's a coward. I need people to respect me if I'm going to fight for those water rights." Of course. Everything was strategy with him, every gesture calculated for its effect on public opinion. Mara should have expected that, should have known better than to mistake practical consideration for actual care. "I see," she said, hating how small her voice sounded. Something flickered across Rhett's face, frustration, maybe, or regret. He set down the hammer and walked over to her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "You asked me to be honest with you," he said. "That's what I'm doing. I won't lie and pretend I built this ramp because I care about your feelings, or because I'm some kind of hero. But that doesn't mean I want you to suffer unnecessarily. There's a difference between using someone and hurting them." "Is there?" Mara's hands tightened on her wheels. "Because from where I'm sitting, it feels like the same thing." "Then you haven't been hurt badly enough yet to know the difference." Rhett's voice went flat, and Mara realized she'd touched something raw. He turned back to the ramp. "I'll have this finished by noon. After that, I need to ride to the eastern section. There's a rancher out there named Colby who might know something about the survey records I'm looking for." "What survey records?" "Maps showing the underground water system. My father had copies, but they disappeared when the holding company took over the ranch. If I can find the original geological surveys, I can prove the water beneath your cabin connects to aquifers running under half the valley. That gives me, legal standing to challenge their current water rights claims." Mara processed this. "So you're not just trying to reclaim your father's ranch. You're trying to prove that everyone who bought property from that holding company doesn't actually own the water they think they do." Smart woman. Rhett picked up the hammer again. "When the truth comes out, every one of those property transfers becomes legally questionable. The holding company will have to renegotiate, probably sell at a loss. And I'll be there to buy my father's land back for a fraction of what they stole it for. That's going to make you enemies. I already have enemies. This just makes them official." Mara watched him work for a moment longer, then rolled back inside. Her head was spinning with the implications of what he'd told her. She'd known this marriage was part of some larger plan, but hearing the scope of it laid out so baldly was different. Rhett wasn't just fighting to reclaim one ranch. He was trying to unravel an entire web of property theft and corruption. And she was sitting at the center of it, holding the one piece of land that made the whole scheme possible. The weight of that realization sat heavy on her chest for the rest of the morning. By afternoon, Rhett had finished the ramp and ridden out, leaving Mara alone with her thoughts and the vast silence of the empty ranch. She spent an hour rolling around the property, testing the limits of where her chair could go. The ground was uneven in places, making progress difficult, but the ramp opened up possibilities she hadn't had at the cabin. She could access the kitchen directly now, could roll out to the well without assistance, could move through this space without constantly waiting for someone to help her. Freedom was a relative term, but this felt close enough. She was heading back inside when she noticed fresh wheel tracks in the dirt, not from Rhett's horse, but from a wagon. Someone had been here recently, probably while she was inside earlier. Mara followed the tracks around to the back of the house, where they stopped near a small shed she hadn't explored yet. The shed door was unlocked. Inside, Mara found stacks of papers, documents, maps spread across a makeshift table. Her breath caught. This must be Rhett's research, everything he'd gathered about the water rights conspiracy. She rolled closer, scanning the documents with growing alarm. Property deeds with signatures that looked forged. Letters between businessmen discussing acquisition strategies that read more like threats. A list of ranchers who'd lost their land in the past 5 years, each name marked with dates and dollar amounts. And maps, dozens of maps showing Red Hollow Valley with water sources marked in blue ink, ownership boundaries in red, notations in Rhett's angular handwriting tracking connections between underground aquifers. One map in particular caught her attention. It showed her cabin and the spring, but also a network of dotted lines extending outward like veins through the valley. Beneath her property, someone had drawn a large circle and written, Primary access point. Controls flow to Mercer Ranch, Colby Property, Carson Homestead, and Town Wells. Estimated capacity, 50,000 plus gallons daily. Mara stared at those numbers, trying to comprehend what they meant. 50,000 gallons. Enough water to support dozens of families, hundreds of cattle, entire farms. No wonder wealthy men wanted to control it. In a drought, whoever owned this water supply owned the valley's future. She heard hoofbeats and quickly rolled out of the shed, not wanting Rhett to know she'd been snooping. But when the rider came around the house, it wasn't Rhett. The man was in his 50s, well-dressed in a way that looked wrong for ranch country. City clothes, expensive hat, polished boots that had never seen a hard day's work. He rode with the confident posture of someone used to being important, used to being obeyed. Behind him rode two others, younger, harder-looking, with the unmistakable air of hired muscle. Mrs. Mercer, I presume. The well-dressed man dismounted with practiced ease, removing his hat in a gesture that was polite on the surface but felt condescending underneath. I heard Rhett had gotten himself a wife. Didn't quite believe it until now. Mara's hands tightened on her wheels. You have me at a disadvantage, Mr. Kane. Silas Kane. He smiled, showing too many teeth. I represent Consolidated Western Resources, the holding company that's been working to develop this valley's potential. I'm here as a courtesy, really, to welcome you to the community and discuss some business matters that may interest you. My husband handles our business matters. Does he now? Kane's smile didn't waver, but something cold entered his eyes. Here's the thing, Mrs. Mercer. Your husband is operating under some serious misunderstandings about property rights and water law. He seems to think that marrying you gives him some kind of legal standing to challenge legitimate business transactions. I'm here to clarify that it doesn't. I think you should leave. In a moment. First, I want to make sure you understand your situation. Kane walked closer, and Mara fought the urge to roll backward. She wouldn't show fear to this man. Consolidated Western owns 12 properties in this valley, all acquired through perfectly legal foreclosures and sales. We've invested significant capital in developing water resources and infrastructure. If your husband tries to challenge those acquisitions, he's going to lose. And when he loses, you're going to lose everything right along with him. We haven't done anything illegal. Yet. Kane glanced at the shed, and Mara's stomach dropped. Had he seen her come out of it? But interfering with established water rights, spreading false claims about property ownership, encouraging landowners to break their existing contracts, those things could very easily become illegal, could even become dangerous. The threat was barely veiled. Mara felt cold despite the afternoon sun. My husband isn't afraid of you, she said, hoping it was true. No, probably not. Rhett never was smart enough to be properly afraid. Kane put his hat back on. But you seem like a reasonable woman, smart enough to know that this valley has room for people who cooperate and no room for people who don't. Your little cabin, that pretty spring, those could stay safe and secure, or they could become very problematic very quickly. Accidents happen on the frontier, Mrs. Mercer. Fires start. Fences break. Sometimes people even get hurt. Are you threatening me? I'm educating you. Kane swung back up into his saddle. Talk to your husband. Make him understand that fighting Consolidated Western is a fight he can't win, because if he doesn't figure that out on his own, we'll have to teach him the hard way. And you'll be standing right next to him when the lesson starts. He rode off, his two men following, leaving Mara alone with her racing heart and the sick certainty that everything Rhett had told her was true, and possibly worse than he'd described. She was still sitting there when Rhett returned an hour later, his face grim. Colby's dead, he said without preamble. Found him this morning in his barn. They're calling it an accident, saying he was kicked by his horse. But Colby's been handling horses for 40 years. He didn't get killed by one unless someone helped it along. Mara's throat went dry. Kane was here. Rhett went very still. What did he say? She told him everything, the threats, the warnings, the barely concealed promise of violence. Rhett listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each sentence. I should have known they'd come after you directly, he said when she finished. Should have had someone here watching the place. You didn't answer my question from this morning, Mara said, about why you're being kind. Was that true, what you said, that it's all just strategy? Rhett looked at her for a long moment. Does it matter? It does to me. He sighed, a sound like exhaustion made audible. I built that ramp because I know what it's like to have your independence stolen. To be trapped in a situation where you can't move, can't act, Can't do a damn thing except watch while people take everything from you. Maybe it's strategy. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe I'm just trying to be less of a bastard than my circumstances require. Take your pick. It wasn't quite an admission of caring, but it was closer than anything else he'd given her. Mara found herself believing it, or at least wanting to believe it. "Colby," she said, changing the subject before the moment could become something neither of them knew how to handle. "You said they killed him?" "Can't prove it, but he was supposed to meet me today, said he had documents that might help. Now he's dead, and whatever papers he had are probably already burned." Rhett walked to the shed, checked inside, then came back looking even grimmer. "Did Kane see you coming out of here?" "I don't know. Maybe." "Then we need to move all this tonight. If they know where I keep my research, they'll come back for it." He paused. "You looked at the documents." "It wasn't a question." Mara nodded. "Then you understand what we're up against." Kane wasn't exaggerating. Consolidated Western has deep pockets and no conscience. They've already killed at least 3 people that I know of, made it look like accidents or natural causes. They're good at this, Mara. They've been doing it for years across half a dozen territories. Then why fight them? If they're that dangerous, that powerful? Because someone has to. Rhett's voice was sharp with something that might have been anger or might have been grief. "My father tried to play by the rules, hired lawyers, filed official complaints, went through proper channels. They destroyed him anyway, made him watch while they stole everything he'd built, then let him die knowing he'd failed. I won't make his mistake. I won't be polite about this." Mara heard the rage beneath his words, recognized it because she'd felt something similar when the town council had stripped her of her teaching position. That helpless fury of watching systems that were supposed to protect you instead conspire against you. "What do you need from me?" she asked. Rhett looked surprised by the question. "What do you mean?" "You married me because you needed access to my land. Fine. But if we're fighting these people, if they're already threatening us, then I need to be part of the plan, not just a piece of property you're protecting. So what do you need from me?" For the first time since she'd met him, Rhett smiled. It was slight, barely there, but real. "I need you to start teaching again," he said. "Spread word that you're offering lessons to any family that can bring their children here. Make this place active, visible, hard to attack without drawing attention. And while you're teaching, I need you to listen. Families talk around teachers. You'll hear things I can't. Complaints about water access, pressure from Consolidated, who's being threatened or bought off. Information we can use. You want me to spy on my students' families. I want you to pay attention. There's a difference." Maybe there was. Or maybe Rhett was just good at making questionable things sound reasonable. But Mara found herself nodding anyway, because what choice did she have? She'd married into this fight the moment she'd said yes to his proposal. "I'll need supplies," she said. "Books, slates, chalk, the basics. Make a list. I'll get everything you need." Rhett glanced at the darkening sky. "For now, help me move these documents inside. We'll hide them under the floorboards in your room. They won't expect us to keep important papers in the cripple's bedroom." The casual cruelty of that phrasing stung, but Mara recognized it as honesty rather than malice. That was exactly what people would think, that the invalid wife was irrelevant, harmless, not worth paying attention to. They spent the next 2 hours transferring documents, Rhett carrying armloads of papers while Mara organized them inside. As they worked, she found herself studying him more carefully. He moved with efficiency, but also with signs of wear, a slight limp she hadn't noticed before, scars on his hands that spoke of violence, the way he sometimes pressed a hand to his ribs as if they pained him. "You're hurt," she said. "Old injury. Acts up in cold weather." "From what?" "A disagreement with the man who didn't want to sell his property." Rhett knelt to pry up one of the floorboards, revealing a hollow space beneath. "Turned out he was more stubborn than I expected. Broke 3 of my ribs before I convinced him otherwise." "Did you kill him?" The question came out before Mara could stop it. Rhett looked up at her, and for a moment she saw something dangerous flash through his eyes. "Would it matter if I had?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I need to know who I married." Mara met his gaze steadily. "You've asked me to trust you, to be part of this fight. But I don't know what kind of man you are. Whether you're actually different from Kane and his people, or just playing the same game from a different angle." Rhett was quiet for a long time, still kneeling beside the open floorboard. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and careful. "I didn't kill him, but I would have if he'd pushed harder. I've killed before, Mara, 3 men, all in situations where it was them or me. I'm not proud of it, but I'm not ashamed either. This territory doesn't reward mercy or hesitation. It rewards whoever's willing to do what's necessary. And you think you're doing what's necessary. I think I'm doing what my father couldn't. What every decent person in this valley is too scared or too civilized to do themselves. He started laying documents into the hollow space beneath the floor. But that doesn't make me a good man, just a useful one. Mara watched him work, trying to reconcile the man who'd built her a ramp with the one who casually admitted he'd killed 3 people. Both versions were true, she realized. Rhett Mercer was capable of consideration and violence, strategy and rage, all existing in the same complicated person. Just like she was learning she could be both the proper schoolteacher and the woman who'd agreed to a marriage that was essentially a business conspiracy. They finished hiding the documents as full darkness fell. Rhett made dinner, salt pork and beans, simple but filling, and they ate in silence at the kitchen table. Mara found herself stealing glances at him, trying to read the thoughts behind those Winter River eyes. There's going to be a town meeting next week, Rhett said eventually. Consolidated Western is proposing new water use regulations. They're packaging it as conservation, claiming the drought requires careful management. But what they're really doing is positioning themselves to control who gets access and who doesn't. Let me guess. Families who cooperate get water. Families who resist don't. Exactly. And once that system is in place, they can squeeze whoever they want. Rhett pushed his plate away. We need to be there. Show the town that we're not intimidated, that we have a right to speak on water matters since your spring makes us one of the largest independent water holders in the valley. Won't that just make us more of a target? We're already a target. At least this way we're a visible one. Harder to make us disappear if everyone knows who we are. The logic was sound, but it didn't make Mara feel any safer. She thought about Kane's threats, about Colby dead in his barn, about the careful way violence disguised itself as accident on the frontier. I'm scared, she said, surprising herself with the admission. Rhett looked at her, and something in his expression softened slightly. Good. Fear keeps you careful, keeps you alive. He stood, began clearing the dishes. But don't let it paralyze you. Scared and moving is better than brave and frozen. It wasn't exactly comfort, but Mara found it oddly reassuring anyway. At least he wasn't pretending this was safe, wasn't offering false promises that everything would be fine. That night, lying in her new bed in her new room with secret documents hidden beneath her floor, Mara couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the maps, the scope of Rhett's plan, the way her small spring connected to an entire underground network that could save or destroy this valley depending on who controlled it. She'd thought marrying Rhett meant trading one kind of cage for another. But maybe it meant something different, trading safety for significance, obscurity for danger, a quiet death for a chance to actually matter in the fight for Red Hollow's future. The question was whether she'd survive long enough to find out. The following days settled into a new rhythm. Rhett spent mornings working on the ranch, repairing fences, maintaining equipment, doing the 100 small tasks that kept a property functional. Afternoons he rode out, meeting with other ranchers, gathering information, building alliances among families who'd been hurt by Consolidated Western's tactics. Mara, meanwhile, began spreading word about her teaching services. She started with nearby families, sending letters to homesteads within a day's ride. The response surprised her. Within a week, she had 3 families committed to sending their children for lessons, with 2 more expressing interest. The first students arrived on a Monday morning. 2 boys and a girl, ages 7 to 12, delivered by a mother who looked exhausted and grateful. Thank you for this, Mrs. Mercer, the woman said. Her name was Helen Garrett, and she ran a failing farm with her husband 10 miles south. The town school's too far for us, and I don't have the learning to teach them proper myself. It's my pleasure, Mara said, and meant it. The moment those children walked into her makeshift classroom, really just the ranch's sitting room with a chalkboard Rhett had installed, she felt something unlock in her chest. This was who she was. Not Mrs. Mercer, not the cripple who'd lost everything, but a teacher with students who needed her. She worked them hard that first day, assessing their reading levels, their arithmetic, their general knowledge. The older boy, Jacob, was bright but undisciplined. His sister Mary was shy but thorough. The younger boy, Thomas, could barely read but had a gift for numbers that Mara recognized immediately as special. You're good at this, she told Thomas during a break. Ever think about being an accountant, banker? The boy's face lit up, then immediately fell. Pa says those jobs aren't for folks like us. Your pa's wrong. Mara kept her voice firm but kind. Folks like us can be anything we're smart enough and stubborn enough to become. Don't let anyone tell you different." She caught Rhett watching from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He disappeared before she could say anything. That evening, as the children were being collected by their parents, Mara overheard Helen Garrett talking to Rhett in low tones. "Pressure from the company," Helen was saying. "They're saying if we don't sign over our water rights, they'll foreclose on the farm. But the terms they're offering are terrible. We'd have to pay them for water that comes from our own well." "Don't sign," Rhett said. "Not yet. I'm working on something that might help. We don't have much time. They want an answer by month's end." "I understand. Just hold on a little longer." Helen nodded, though she looked doubtful. After she left, Rhett came inside and found Mara cleaning the chalkboard. "How'd it go?" he asked. "Good. They're smart kids, need structure and consistency, but they're eager to learn." Mara paused. "Helen's in trouble. Half the valley's in trouble. Consolidated's accelerating their timeline, pressuring families to sign before anyone can organize resistance." Rhett leaned against the doorframe. "The town meeting's in 4 days. That's when they'll make their big push for the new regulations. If those pass, families like the Garretts won't have a choice anymore." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to stand up at that meeting and explain exactly what Consolidated Western is trying to do. Show everyone the pattern, the foreclosures, the suspicious deaths, the way they're using legal manipulation to steal water rights, force them to defend their actions publicly." "They'll destroy you." "Probably." Rhett's smile was grim. "But at least people will hear the truth first. That's more than my father got." Mara looked at this man she'd married, this complicated, angry, damaged person who was preparing to sacrifice himself for a valley full of people who didn't even know he was trying to save them. "I'm coming with you," she said. "To the meeting?" "Mara, that's not... I'm your wife. Where you go, I go. And if you're going to accuse Consolidated Western publicly, you'll need witnesses. You'll need someone who can corroborate your story, someone they can't easily dismiss." She rolled closer to him. "I'm a school teacher, Rhett. People trust teachers. If I stand beside you and say I believe you, that carries weight." He studied her for a long moment. "This isn't your fight. It became my fight the moment I married you. The moment Cain threatened me on this property. The moment I realized that the families sending their children here for lessons are the same families Consolidated's trying to destroy." Mara's voice hardened. "I'm not sitting on the sidelines while you fight alone. That's not who I am." Something shifted in Rhett's expression. Respect, maybe, or recognition. "You're tougher than I gave you credit for. Everyone is once you back them into a corner." Mara turned back to the chalkboard. "Now tell me everything you're planning to say at that meeting. If I'm going to support you, I need to know the full strategy." They spent the next 3 hours going over his plan, refining arguments, anticipating counterattacks. By the time they finished, Mara's head was spinning with property law and water rights, and the 100 ways Consolidated Western had manipulated the system. But beneath the exhaustion, she felt something else stirring: purpose. For the first time since the accident, she felt like she was part of something bigger than her own survival. The night before the town meeting, Mara couldn't sleep again. She lay in bed listening to Rhett moving around the house, preparing for whatever was coming. Around midnight, she heard him walk past her door, pause, then continue to his own room. She was about to drift off when she heard a sound that made her blood freeze. Horses outside, multiple riders, moving slowly around the property. Not the casual approach of visitors, but the careful circling of predators. Mara rolled to her window and peered through the curtain. In the moonlight, she counted 5 riders, all carrying rifles. They weren't shooting, weren't approaching the house, just riding the perimeter, sending a message. "We know where you live. We can come back any time." She heard Rhett's door open, saw him slip outside with his own rifle. He didn't confront the riders, just stood on the porch watching them with the patient stillness of a man who knew that violence could wait. After 10 minutes, the riders moved off, disappearing into the darkness. Rhett came back inside and knocked softly on Mara's door. You awake?" "Yes." He opened the door, stood in the threshold. "That was a warning. They'll escalate after tomorrow's meeting." "I know. You can still back out. Stay here while I go alone." "I won't." Rhett nodded slowly. "Then you should know. If this goes wrong, if they come after us directly, I won't let them take you. Whatever I have to do to keep you safe, I'll do it, even if it means things get bloody." It should have sounded threatening. Instead, it sounded like a promise. "I understand," Mara said. "Do you?" Rhett stepped closer. "I'm not a good man, Mara. I'm using you, using this marriage, Using your land to fight a war, I started long before I met you, but that doesn't mean I'll let them hurt you. That's the line. That's where strategy ends and something else begins. Mara felt her throat tighten. What else? Rhett didn't answer, just looked at her with those cold eyes that suddenly didn't seem quite so cold anymore. Get some sleep, he said finally. Tomorrow's going to be rough. He left, closing the door softly behind him, and Mara sat in the darkness wondering what had just happened. Wondering if the man who'd married her for strategic reasons was starting to care about her for different ones. Wondering if she was starting to care about him too. The thought terrified her more than Kane's threats, or the Midnight Riders, or any of it. Because caring meant vulnerability. Meant risking the heart she'd been carefully protecting since the accident had taught her that people only valued you for what you could do, not who you were. But as she finally drifted toward sleep, Mara realized something. Rhett had never once treated her like she was less because of her chair. Had never pitied her or handled her delicately or acted like her disability defined her worth. He treated her like an equal partner in an impossible situation. And maybe that was its own kind of care, rough and unpolished as it was. Morning came too fast. They dressed carefully, Mara in her best dress, Rhett in clean clothes that made him look less like a drifter and more like a respectable rancher. The ride to town was tense, neither of them speaking much, both preparing for the confrontation ahead. Red Hollow's town hall was packed when they arrived. Every family in the valley had sent someone, drawn by word that Consolidated Western would be making an important announcement. Mara recognized faces from her teaching days, former students' parents, families she'd known for years. Most avoided her eyes, uncomfortable with her presence or her chair or both. Kane was already there, standing at the front of the room beside a nervous-looking man Mara didn't recognize. When Kane saw Rhett and Mara enter, his expression hardened into something ugly. "Well," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "look who decided to join us, Mr. and Mrs. Mercer, troublemakers extraordinaire." The room went silent. Rhett helped position Mara's chair, then stood beside her, his hand resting casually on her shoulder. The gesture looked protective, possessive even, and Mara understood immediately what he was doing, showing the town they were united, that attacking one meant attacking both. "We're here to participate in a public meeting about water rights," Rhett said calmly, "unless Consolidated Western has a problem with citizens exercising their voice." "Not at all," Kane said, though his smile was sharp. "We welcome all input, even from people who don't understand the first thing about proper water management." The meeting began. The nervous man, apparently a territorial water commissioner, explained the proposed regulations in dense legal language that clearly bored most of the audience. But Mara listened carefully, noting the critical details. The regulations would establish a permit system for all water use. Permits would be issued by a committee chosen by, surprise, Consolidated Western. Appeals would go through Consolidated's lawyers. Violations would result in fines or property seizure. It was a trap disguised as bureaucracy. Once these regulations passed, Consolidated would control every drop of water in the valley. When the commissioner finished, Kane stood up to address the room. "These regulations are for everyone's protection," he said smoothly. "The drought's getting worse. We need coordinated management to ensure fair distribution. Consolidated Western is willing to shoulder the burden of administration. At what cost?" Rhett's voice cut through the room. Kane's smile didn't waver. "I'm sorry, did you have a comment, Mr. Mercer?" "I have several." Rhett stepped forward, and Mara felt the room's attention shift entirely to him. First, these regulations aren't about conservation. They're about control. Consolidated Western wants to decide who gets water and who doesn't, which means they'll decide who gets to stay in this valley and who gets forced out. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Kane's expression darkened. "Second," Rhett continued, "Consolidated Western's entire presence in this valley is built on fraud. They've acquired 12 properties through foreclosures they engineered, deaths that were suspiciously convenient, and legal manipulations that wouldn't hold up under proper scrutiny." "That's a serious accusation," Kane said coldly. "Do you have proof?" "I have patterns. Rancher refuses to sell. Suddenly, his credit's called in by banks that Consolidated controls. Farmer tries to fight back. Suddenly, there's an accident. Property owner discovers water on his land. Suddenly, Consolidated shows up with surveys that claim the water belongs to them." Rhett's voice grew harder. "My father was one of those property owners, Samuel Mercer, in case anyone here remembers him. He fought Consolidated for 3 years, and 3 years later he was dead, and they owned everything he'd built. The room went silent. Several older ranchers were nodding. They remembered. Your father, Kane said carefully, died of natural causes. Heart failure, if I recall correctly. After 3 years of constant legal harassment and financial pressure. After watching his life's work get stolen piece by piece. You might not have put a bullet in him, Kane, but you killed him just as surely. Kane's mask of politeness finally cracked. You're upset, Mr. Mercer. Understandably so. But personal grief doesn't excuse slander. Consolidated Western operates within the law, a law you've rigged in your favor. Rhett pulled out a document from his coat. I have here a copy of the geological survey conducted on my father's property 5 years ago. It shows an underground aquifer system running through his land. That survey mysteriously disappeared from public records right after Consolidated took ownership. Convenient, since if people knew about that aquifer, they might question how Consolidated suddenly claimed water rights to properties a mile away. He walked forward, placed the document on the commissioner's table. That aquifer connects to the spring on my wife's property. The same spring that Consolidated tried to acquire before I married her. They wanted it because it gives access to the entire underground system that legally belongs to the individual property owners above it, not to any holding company. Mara watched Kane's face turn red. You're making a spectacle of yourself. These theories aren't theories. Mara spoke up for the first time, and everyone turned to look at her. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. I've seen the documents Mr. Mercer has collected. I've read the patterns, and I can tell you that 3 families currently sending their children to me for lessons have all received threats from Consolidated Western in the past month. All 3 were told to sign over their water rights or face foreclosure. All 3 were told that refusal would have consequences. Teaching children doesn't make you a legal expert, Kane snapped. No, but it makes me someone families trust. Mara rolled forward slightly. And those families are starting to realize they're being manipulated, that this valley's water belongs to them, not to wealthy men from back east who see our drought as a business opportunity. The room erupted into conversation, ranchers arguing with neighbors, families questioning the regulations, people demanding to see Rhett's documents. Kane tried to regain control, but the damage was done. The careful narrative Consolidated had constructed was fracturing. Kane's eyes found Mara's across the room, and what she saw there made her blood run cold. Pure rage, barely contained. This meeting is adjourned, the commissioner said nervously. We'll table the regulations until further review. Like hell we will. Kane's voice cracked like a whip. These regulations are necessary and legal. If Mr. Mercer has concerns, he can file them through proper channels instead of disrupting public meetings with conspiracy theories and stolen documents. Stolen? Rhett's voice went dangerous. Those surveys were public record. The fact that they're not anymore proves my point about corruption. It proves you're a thief and a liar. Kane stepped toward Rhett. And I promise you, Mr. Mercer, this little performance is going to cost you. Consolidated Western doesn't take kindly to defamation. Is that a threat? It's a guarantee. The 2 men stood facing each other, and Mara could feel violence hovering in the air between them, waiting for an excuse to erupt. She rolled forward, positioning herself between them. Gentlemen, she said firmly, we're in a public meeting. Whatever personal disputes you have can be settled elsewhere. Kane looked down at her, and his expression was one of pure contempt. Stay out of this, cripple. Adults are talking. The room went dead silent. Mara felt the word like a slap, felt every eye in the hall turn toward her with a mixture of pity and embarrassment. But before she could respond, Rhett moved. He didn't hit Kane, not yet, just grabbed him by the collar and lifted him slightly onto his toes, his face inches from the other man's. You will apologize to my wife, Rhett said quietly, or I will break your jaw in front of everyone here. Your choice. Kane tried to pull away, but Rhett's grip was iron. For a moment, Mara thought violence would win. Then Kane seemed to remember where he was, who was watching. My apologies, Mrs. Mercer, he said through gritted teeth. I spoke in anger. Rhett released him and stepped back. The meeting's over, but this conversation isn't finished. They left the town hall in tense silence, Mara's heart still racing from the confrontation. She could feel the entire town watching them go, could hear the whispers starting before they'd even cleared the door. That went well, she said once they were outside. Rhett almost smiled. Could have gone worse. He called me. I know what he called you. Rhett's voice was tight with barely controlled rage. And if we weren't in a room full of witnesses, I would have killed him for it. Mara believed him, and the intensity of his anger on her behalf felt almost overwhelming. They were loading her chair onto the wagon when they heard footsteps behind them. Helen Garrett approached, looking frightened but determined. "Mr. Mercer," she said quietly, "my husband and I, we want to help. Whatever you're planning, whatever you need, we're with you." 3 other families approached as they were leaving town, each offering similar support. By the time they headed back to the ranch, Rhett had 7 families committed to resisting Consolidated's pressure, to standing together instead of signing away their rights individually. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The ride home felt different than the ride there, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. They'd drawn a line, made themselves visible targets. Now the real fight would begin. As they reached the ranch, Mara noticed something that made her stomach drop. Fresh tracks in the dirt. Multiple riders had been here while they were gone. Rhett saw it too. He pulled the wagon to a stop and grabbed his rifle. "Stay here." "Rhett, stay here." He approached the house carefully, checking every window, every door. When he finally waved her forward, his face was grim. Inside, the house had been searched, not ransacked, too professional for that. But drawers had been opened, papers rifled through, furniture moved slightly. They'd been looking for something. Mara's blood ran cold. The documents. They rushed to her room. The floorboards looked undisturbed, but when Rhett pried them up, they found the hollow space empty. Every document, every map, every piece of evidence he'd collected, gone. They knew, Rhett said quietly. Somehow they knew where to look. Mara thought about Kane's glance at the shed that first day, about the midnight riders, about how much Consolidated Western seemed to know about their movements. They've been watching us. Or someone's been talking. Rhett sat back on his heels, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked defeated. Those documents were everything. Without them, I can't prove the water system connections. Can't challenge their property claims. Can't what? Can't protect you. He looked up at her, and Mara saw something in his eyes she'd never seen before. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. Without proof, we're just troublemakers making noise. They'll come after us hard now, Mara, and I don't know if I can stop them. Mara rolled closer to him, placed a hand on his shoulder. Then we'll figure something else out. There has to be another way. There isn't. Those surveys, those documents, they took me 2 years to collect. Some of them were originals, irreplaceable. His voice cracked slightly. I failed, just like my father. You're not your father, Mara's voice was firm. And this isn't over. We got 7 families to commit to resistance today. That's 7 more than we had this morning. That's not failure. Rhett looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Not the crippled school teacher he'd married for convenience, but someone stronger, someone who refused to quit even when quitting was the logical choice. How are you not terrified? He asked. I am terrified. Mara's hand tightened on his shoulder. But I've been terrified before. It's not fatal. Something passed between them then. Understanding, maybe, or solidarity. The recognition that they were both broken people trying to fight a battle that was probably unwinnable, and somehow that shared impossibility mattered more than victory. Rhett stood, helped her back into her chair. We should eat something, figure out next steps. They made dinner together, moving around the kitchen in a silence that was different now, less distant, more companionable. As they ate, they talked through options, strategies, backup plans. None of them were good, but having any plan felt better than nothing. That night, after the dishes were cleaned and the house was locked tight, Rhett stopped at Mara's door again. Thank you, he said. For what? For standing with me today. For not leaving when you saw how bad this really is. Mara smiled slightly. Where would I go? You're stuck with me, Mercer. He almost smiled back. Almost. Then he said something that made her chest tighten. I'm glad. He left before she could respond, and Mara sat alone in her room wondering when exactly this marriage of convenience had started becoming something else. Something real. Something that, in the middle of all this danger and chaos, felt like the first honest thing that had happened to her since the accident stole her legs and the town stole her future. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over Red Hollow, and somewhere in the darkness, enemies were planning their next move. But for now, in this moment, Mara had a purpose, a partner, and a reason to fight. It would have to be enough. The retaliation came faster than either of them expected. 2 days after the town meeting, the Garrett farm burned. Helen's husband managed to get the family out, but the barn and half their winter supplies went up in flames that could be seen for miles. The territorial marshal ruled it an accident, lantern oil, dry hay, careless mistake. But everyone knew better. Everyone understood the message. Rhett rode out as soon as he heard, returning that evening with Helen and her 3 children in tow. The woman looked like she'd aged 10 years in 2 days, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and fear. They came in the night, Helen told Mara, while Rhett settled the children in the spare room. 2 men, maybe 3. We heard horses, smelled smoke, and by the time we got outside, the whole barn was lit. My husband tried to fight the fire, but she shook her head. It was too late. Everything we had stored for winter, gone. Did you see their faces? They wore masks, but one of them had a scar here. Helen touched her left cheek. Same man who came with Cain when they tried to make us sign the water rights over. Mara felt cold rage settle in her stomach. How long can you stay here? Don't know. Few days, maybe. But we can't impose. You're not imposing. You're staying as long as you need to. Mara reached across the table, squeezed Helen's hand. That's what this fight means. We protect each other. Helen's eyes filled with tears. My husband wants to sign. Wants to give them what they want so they'll leave us alone. I told him it won't make a difference. Once they know you'll break, they'll just take more. Your husband's scared. That's understandable. He's a coward. Helen's voice cracked. And maybe he's right to be. Maybe we should have just given them what they wanted from the start. Mara understood the impulse. The desperate hope that surrender would buy safety, that cooperation would earn mercy. She'd felt the same way after the accident, when the town had offered her that charity home back east. The temptation to just give up, to stop fighting, to let someone else decide her future. But mercy from people like Cain was a lie. Surrender just meant dying on your knees instead of your feet. You did the right thing, Mara said firmly. Coming here, refusing to break. Your children are watching, Helen. What you show them now, that's what they'll remember when they're grown, whether their mother gave up or kept fighting. Helen wiped her eyes, managed a weak smile. You sound like a teacher. I am a teacher, and one thing I've learned, children are stronger than we give them credit for. They can handle truth. What they can't handle is watching adults lie to them about how the world works. They were interrupted by Rhett coming back inside, his expression grim. 3 more farms hit tonight. 1 south of here, 2 east. Same pattern. Fires, masked riders, no witnesses. The marshal's calling it a crime wave, says he's investigating. He's not going to do anything, Helen said bitterly. No, Rhett agreed. He's not. Consolidated owns him same as they own half the territorial government. He poured himself coffee with hands that weren't quite steady. We're running out of time. They're escalating, trying to break the resistance before it can organize properly. Then we organize faster, Mara said. How many families committed to standing with us? 7 at the meeting, probably lost 2 after tonight's fires, maybe 3. So we have 4. That's enough to start with. Rhett looked at her like she'd lost her mind. 4 families can't fight Consolidated Western. 4 families can't win a war. But they can survive until help arrives. Mara rolled to the table, pulled out paper and pencil. We need to think differently. Consolidated's using fear and isolation, hitting families one at a time, making everyone feel alone. We counter that by making it impossible for them to isolate us. How? We bring everyone here. Turn this ranch into a refuge. Anyone who refuses to sign Consolidated's papers, anyone being threatened or burned out, they come here. We pool resources, share security, make ourselves too visible to attack quietly. Rhett was quiet for a long moment. That puts a target on this property. The target's already here. At least this way we choose the ground we're fighting on. Mara started writing. Helen's family stays. We send word to the other families who committed. Tell them they're welcome here, that we'll protect them. Meanwhile, I keep teaching. Make this ranch a school, a community center. Get people talking to each other, sharing information. And when Cain decides to hit us directly, then we make sure the whole valley sees it. Make it impossible for him to claim it was an accident or isolated incident. Mara looked up at him. You said yourself, visibility is protection, so we get visible. Helen was nodding slowly. It could work. My cousin runs a homestead near the eastern ridge. She's been resisting Consolidated's pressure. I could reach out to her. Do it, Mara said. Anyone you know who might stand with us, anyone being threatened, spread the word. Over the next 3 days, the ranch transformed. Helen's cousin arrived with her family, a husband, 2 daughters, and a grandmother who looked like she could chew nails. Then came the Hendersons, a young couple who'd lost their water access when Consolidated cut off the creek running through their property. Then Marcus Webb, a former soldier who'd settled in Red Hollow after the war and now faced foreclosure on his small farm. By the end of the week, Rhett's ranch housed 11 adults and 7 children, all crammed into a space meant for 2 people. The main house overflowed into makeshift shelters in the barn, tents pitched in the yard, a communal kitchen organized by Helen and the other women. It was chaotic and uncomfortable, and exactly what Mara had hoped for. Too many witnesses for Consolidated to eliminate quietly. The children ranged from age 5 to 14, and Mara threw herself into teaching with an intensity that surprised even her. Every morning, weather permitting, she held classes outside where the whole valley could see. Reading, arithmetic, history, civics. She taught them about property rights and water law, made sure they understood exactly what was being stolen from their families and why. Knowledge is power, she told them one afternoon, standing before a makeshift chalkboard Rhett had built. And the people trying to control this valley don't want you to have power. They want you ignorant and scared, so every fact you learn, every skill you develop, that's a weapon against them. Thomas, the boy with the gift for numbers, raised his hand. Mrs. Mercer, are we in danger? The other children went quiet, waiting for her answer. Mara could have lied, could have offered false comfort. Instead, she told them the truth. Yes, we're in danger. But danger doesn't mean defeat. It means we have to be smarter, braver, and more stubborn than the people trying to hurt us. She looked at each child in turn. Your parents brought you here because they believe in something worth protecting. Not just land or water, but the idea that ordinary people deserve to control their own futures. That's worth being scared for. That's worth fighting for. Jacob, the older boy, spoke up. My pa says Mr. Mercer's going to get us all killed. Your pa might be right, Mara said calmly. Or Mr. Mercer might be the only person brave enough to stand up when everyone else wants to hide. Time will tell. She caught Rhett watching from near the barn, his expression unreadable. He'd been different since the night they'd found the documents stolen. More present, more engaged with the families gathering on his property. He organized security rotations, taught the men how to watch for raiders, showed them where to position themselves for maximum visibility. But he also did smaller things. Helped the grandmother carry water, fixed a broken wagon wheel for the Hendersons, played an awkward game of catch with one of the younger boys who'd lost his own father to Consolidated's foreclosure tactics. Mara saw him struggling with it, this unexpected role of protector and leader. He'd planned for a solitary revenge, a cold strategic campaign. Instead, he'd somehow become responsible for a dozen frightened people who looked to him for answers he didn't always have. You're good with them, she told him one evening after the children had gone to bed. They were sitting on the porch, sharing watch duty while the others slept. I don't know what I'm doing, Rhett admitted. I'm a fighter, Mara. Not a... whatever this is. A community organizer. He snorted. That's a generous term for it. It's the accurate term. Whether you planned for it or not, you've built something here. People are choosing to stand with you. They're choosing to stand with you. You're the one teaching their children, making them believe there's hope. Rhett was quiet for a moment. I just gave them a place to hide. You gave them more than that. You gave them permission to fight back. Mara watched the stars overhead, bright and cold in the autumn sky. That matters more than you know. They sat in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds, crickets, a distant coyote, the soft breathing of horses in the barn. It felt almost peaceful, this moment, though Mara knew it was just the calm before whatever storm was coming. I keep thinking about my father, Rhett said suddenly, wondering what he'd make of this. He tried to fight them legally, respectably, died believing he'd failed because he couldn't beat them at their own game. You think he'd approve of your methods? I think he'd be horrified, but he'd also still be alive if he'd fought dirty from the start. Rhett's voice went hard. The frontier doesn't reward honor, Mara. It rewards whoever's willing to survive by any means necessary. Is that what you're doing? Surviving? What else is there? Living? There's a difference. Rhett looked at her then, and something in his expression made Mara's breath catch. You think I'm not living? I think you're so focused on revenge that you've forgotten what you're actually fighting for. It's not just about taking back your father's ranch anymore, Rhett. It's about all these people who trust you, about the valley's future, about you? The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Mara felt her heart beating too fast. About all of us, she said carefully. We're in this together now. That's not what I asked. Mara met his eyes, saw something there she hadn't allowed herself to acknowledge before. Want. Not just strategic interest or protective duty, but genuine human want. The kind that complicated everything. I don't know what you're asking, she said, which was a lie. She knew exactly what he was asking. Rhett reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face. His hand was rough with calluses, warm despite the cool night. I'm asking if this marriage is still just a business arrangement to you, or if it started becoming something else. Mara should have pulled away, should have reminded him of their agreement, kept things professional and distant. Instead, she found herself leaning into his touch. It's complicated, she whispered. Everything's complicated. Rhett's thumb traced her cheekbone, gentle, despite the violence she knew those hands were capable of. But that doesn't answer the question. Before Mara could respond, they heard shouting from inside the house. They both moved instantly, Rhett grabbing his rifle while Mara rolled toward the door. Inside, Marcus Webb stood by the window, pointing toward the eastern ridge. Riders, he said urgently. At least a dozen, coming fast. Everyone woke at once, the house erupting into controlled chaos. The women gathered the children into the main bedroom, the safest room with the fewest windows. The men grabbed weapons and spread out, taking defensive positions. Mara positioned herself where she could see the approaching riders, her heart hammering. Rhett stood on the porch, rifle ready but not raised, waiting. The riders came into the yard and stopped just beyond rifle range. In the moonlight, Mara recognized Kane's silhouette in the lead. But the man beside him was new, older, expensively dressed even for a midnight raid, sitting his horse with the confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for anything. Mercer, Kane called out. We need to talk. Talk from there, Rhett called back. You're not welcome closer. This is Elias Whitmore, Kane said, gesturing to the man beside him. He's the Territorial Director for Consolidated Western Resources. Came all the way from Denver to meet you. That's quite an honor. I'm not impressed. Whitmore spoke then, his voice carrying the cultured accent of East Coast education. Mr. Mercer, I understand you have grievances with our company. I'm here to offer a reasonable resolution. The only resolution I want is my father's property returned, and your company out of this valley. That's not reasonable. That's fantasy. Whitmore urged his horse a few steps closer. But what I can offer is generous compensation for your cooperation. $50,000 to be exact. In exchange, you cease your campaign against Consolidated, convince these families to accept our terms, and sign over your wife's water rights to proper management. The silence that followed was absolute. $50,000 was more money than most people in Red Hollow would see in a lifetime. It was enough to start over anywhere, to buy land far from this drought-stricken valley and never look back. And if I refuse, Rhett asked, then we'll proceed with legal action. We have documentation proving you've been spreading false information, encouraging breach of contract, even theft of company property. Whitmore's smile was thin. You'll be arrested, Mr. Mercer. Your property will be seized. These families harboring here will face charges as accomplices. And your wife, well, I imagine the territorial courts won't look kindly on a woman who can't properly maintain or defend her land. She'll lose everything. Mara felt ice in her veins. The threat was clear. Cooperate or be destroyed through legal mechanisms they controlled completely. You have until dawn to decide, Whitmore continued. After that, the offer expires and the consequences begin. They rode off, leaving Rhett standing on the porch with his rifle and his impossible choice. The house erupted into frightened conversation the moment the riders disappeared. Families arguing in hushed voices, children crying despite the adults' attempts to comfort them. Helen found Mara in the kitchen, her face pale. $50,000, Helen whispered. That's enough to save all of us. He should take it. He won't. How do you know? Because I know him. Mara surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. This isn't about money for Rhett. It never was. Then what's it about? His father, justice. Proving that ordinary people can stand against power and win. Mara looked toward where Rhett had disappeared outside. He'd rather die fighting than live knowing he surrendered. That's insane. Maybe. But it's also the only thing keeping any of us safe right now. The moment Rhett breaks, we all become targets again. At least this way we're protected by his stubbornness. Helen shook her head, but didn't argue further. Over the next hour, Mara watched families fracture over the decision. Marcus Webb wanted to stay and fight. The Hendersons wanted to take the offer. Helen's cousin thought they should scatter, each family fending for themselves. Only the grandmother remained certain. Running just means dying tired, the old woman said firmly. I've seen it before. Men like Whitmore don't keep promises. They make offers to identify who's willing to betray their neighbors, then they crush everyone anyway. Mara found Rhett an hour before dawn standing by the corral where his horse waited. He wasn't preparing to ride out, just standing there in the darkness, shoulders tense with the weight of his decision. Everyone's waiting to hear what you'll do, Mara said quietly. I know. $50,000 could save lives, Rhett. Could give these families a fresh start. It could, if Whitmore actually meant it. Rhett turned to face her. But he doesn't. This is a test. He's trying to figure out if I can be bought, if the resistance can be fractured. The moment I take that money, he'll find reasons why half of it has to go to administrative fees. He'll require these families to sign new contracts with worse terms. He'll bleed everyone dry while making it look like my fault. You can't know that for certain. Yes, I can. Because that's what they did to my father. Made him an offer, convinced him to trust their process, then used his cooperation against him. Rhett's jaw tightened. I won't make his mistake. Even if it means people get hurt? People are already getting hurt. The question is whether they get hurt fighting or get hurt surrendering. He stepped closer to her. What do you think I should do? Mara was quiet for a long moment. I think you should be honest with everyone. Tell them exactly what you just told me. Why you believe the offer's a trap. Then let them choose. Some might leave. That's their right. And if they all leave, then we fight alone. Mara reached for his hand, held it tight. But I don't think they will. These families didn't come here because they believe in you, Rhett. They came because they're out of options, same as me. And people without options are either the most dangerous or the most desperate. We need to help them become the former. Rhett squeezed her hand back, and for a moment they just stood there in the pre-dawn darkness, two broken people holding on to each other while the world threatened to collapse around them. When dawn broke, Rhett called everyone together. The families gathered in the yard, tired and frightened and waiting for answers. Mara positioned herself where everyone could see her, not hidden, not protected, but standing visibly beside Rhett as his partner. I'm refusing Whitmore's offer, Rhett said without preamble. I believe it's a trap designed to break our unity and make us easier to control. But this fight isn't just mine anymore. You all have families, futures, lives that matter, so I'm giving each of you a choice. He pulled out a stack of bills. His own money, Mara realized, the cash he'd been saving for supplies and emergencies. Anyone who wants to leave can take enough money to get established somewhere new. I won't judge you, won't think less of you. You came here because you were desperate, not because you signed up for a war. If you want out, take the money and go. No questions asked. The families looked at each other, uncertain. Marcus Webb spoke first. I'm staying. Consolidated stole my farm, my livelihood. I've got nothing left to lose and nowhere else to go. I'm staying too, Helen said, surprising herself as much as everyone else. My husband's already left. Took the wagon this morning, said he was done fighting. But I have children who need to see their mother stand for something. So I'm staying. One by one, families made their choices. The Hendersons left, taking Rhett's money with guilty thanks. Helen's cousins stayed. The grandmother stayed, saying she was too old to start running now. By the time the sun fully cleared the horizon, Rhett still had 7 adults and 5 children committed to the fight. It wasn't many, but it was enough. That afternoon, Mara was teaching the children their letters when a single rider approached. Not Kane or Whitmore's men, but a younger man wearing a deputy's star. He looked nervous, kept glancing over his shoulder like he expected someone to stop him. Mrs. Mercer? He dismounted carefully. I'm Deputy Frank Morrison. I need to speak with you and your husband. Rhett came out from the barn, hand near his gun. What do you want? Morrison held up empty hands. I'm not here officially. I'm here because my conscience won't let me stay quiet anymore. He pulled a folded paper from his jacket. This is a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Mercer. It'll be served tomorrow at noon. The charges are fraud, theft of company property, and inciting criminal conspiracy. That's ridiculous, Mara said. Rhett hasn't stolen anything. I know, but Consolidated's lawyers have documentation that says otherwise. Forged, probably, but it'll hold up long enough to get him in jail, And once he's there, Morrison's voice dropped. Prisoners have accidents, fall down stairs, provoke other inmates, get sick from bad food. No one asks too many questions. Rhett's expression didn't change. Why are you telling me this? Because my brother lost his farm to Consolidated 3 years ago. Died 6 months later, broken and bankrupt. I wore this badge thinking I could help people, but all I do is enforce laws that protect the wealthy and crush everyone else. Morrison looked at the families gathered in the yard. I'm done being part of that system. You're risking your job, Mara said. Maybe worse. I know, but I've got to be able to look at myself in the mirror. This is what that costs. Morrison climbed back on his horse. I don't know how to help you fight them, Mr. Mercer, but I won't be part of arresting you for a crime you didn't commit. That's all I can offer. He rode away before anyone could respond, leaving them with 12 hours before the warrant would be served. The families gathered again, this time with real fear setting in. If Rhett was arrested, the whole resistance collapsed. Without his leadership, his strategic thinking, his sheer, stubborn refusal to break, they were just scattered families with nowhere to go. We could run, Marcus suggested, get Rhett out of the territory before they can arrest him. Then they seize this property and everyone here becomes homeless, Rhett countered. Running doesn't solve anything. Staying means they arrest you, probably kill you. Helen's voice shook. What good does your death do anyone? It exposes them, makes them show their hand publicly. Rhett looked around at the anxious faces. But that only works if someone's watching, someone who can document what happens and spread the truth. Mara understood immediately what he was planning. You want to force a confrontation, make them arrest you in front of witnesses, make it impossible to claim it was quiet or legal. Exactly. If I disappear in the night, no one cares. But if I'm arrested in broad daylight, in front of families and children, with deputies reading charges everyone knows are false, that becomes a story. Stories spread. Stories don't stop bullets, the grandmother said bluntly. No, but they change how people see what's happening. Right now, Consolidated's winning because everyone thinks they're alone, thinks no one else is fighting. We make my arrest visible. We show the valley that resistance is possible, that someone's willing to pay the price. Mara felt sick. He was talking about sacrificing himself, turning his own arrest into propaganda. It was brilliant and terrible in equal measure. No, she said firmly. There has to be another way. There isn't, you know that. I won't let you martyr yourself for this cause, Rhett. I won't. She stopped, realizing what she'd almost said, that she cared too much to watch him die, that somewhere in the past weeks, this marriage of convenience had become something real enough to break her heart. Rhett must have seen it in her face because his expression softened. Mara, I said no. She rolled forward, positioning herself between him and the others. We're not doing this. We're not giving Consolidated the satisfaction of destroying you. Then what do you suggest? Mara's mind raced. There had to be an angle they weren't seeing, some way to turn this arrest into something other than defeat. She thought about the families gathered here, about the children watching everything with wide eyes, about Deputy Morrison risking his job to warn them. And suddenly she knew. We don't hide. We don't run. We make sure every person in Red Hollow sees exactly what Consolidated's doing. She turned to Marcus. How fast can you ride to town? Couple hours, maybe less if I push it. Go. Spread word that Rhett Mercer's being arrested tomorrow at noon for fighting Consolidated Western. Tell everyone who'll listen that if they want to see what corporate corruption looks like, they should come watch. Make it an event. Marcus's eyes widened. You want an audience? I want witnesses. I want families who've been too scared to resist seeing that they're not alone. I want Consolidated forced to arrest a man in front of half the valley while children watch. Mara's voice was fierce now. They're counting on us being quiet, on this happening in shadows. So we drag it into the brightest light possible. Helen caught on. And I'll bring every family I know. Make sure there are women and children everywhere, making it impossible for violence to seem justified. Exactly. Mara looked at Rhett. They want to make you a criminal? Fine. We'll make you a symbol instead. And when they arrest you, everyone will see exactly what that means. For the first time since Morrison had delivered the warning, Rhett smiled. Not his usual grim half-smile, but something genuine and warm. You're terrifying when you're strategic, he said. I learned from you. They spent the rest of the day preparing. Marcus rode out to spread word through the valley. Helen and her cousin visited nearby homesteads, inviting families to witness history. The grandmother organized the children, rehearsing what they'd say if anyone asked why they were there. "We're here to learn what justice looks like," the kids practiced saying. "Our teacher says paying attention is how you change the world." As night fell, Mara found herself unable to sleep. She kept thinking about the morning, about watching Rhett get arrested, about the 100 ways this plan could go wrong. Around midnight, she heard his door open, heard him walk to the kitchen. She followed. He was making coffee, moving quietly to avoid waking anyone. When he saw her, he poured a second cup without asking. "Can't sleep?" he said. "Too much to think about." They sat at the table, drinking coffee in comfortable silence. After a while, Rhett spoke. "I need to tell you something, in case tomorrow goes badly." "Don't listen." His voice was gentle but firm. "If I don't make it back, if they kill me in that jail cell, there's a letter hidden in the barn. Top beam, eastern corner. It's got instructions for filing claims with the territorial governor, names of officials who might actually help, everything you need to keep fighting without me." Mara's throat tightened. "Rhett, and there's something else in that letter. Something I should have said weeks ago but didn't know how." He reached across the table, took her hand. "I didn't marry you just for the water rights, Mara. I mean, that's why I started this, why I showed up at your cabin that first day. But it stopped being just strategy pretty quickly." "When?" "When you refused to be grateful. When you demanded to know the truth instead of accepting comfortable lies." His thumb traced circles on her palm. "I expected to marry a victim who'd be quietly thankful for rescue. Instead, I got a partner who's stronger than I am." "I'm not stronger. You are. You've lost more than I have, and you're not consumed by revenge. You're still building things, teaching children, creating hope. That's harder than anything I've done." Mara felt tears threatening. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because tomorrow I might not get another chance. And I need you to know that whatever happens, this marriage became real for me. You became real for me. I care about you, Mara, not as a strategic asset or a means to an end, but as the woman I want to wake up beside every morning for whatever future we can build." The words hung between them, enormous and terrifying, and exactly what Mara needed to hear. She stood, rolled to where he sat, close enough that their knees touched. "I care about you too," she whispered. "I didn't want to, didn't plan to. But somewhere between your terrible proposal and now, you became the most important person in my life. And I'm not losing you tomorrow. I won't let that happen." Rhett cupped her face in both hands, leaned down, and kissed her. It wasn't gentle or romantic or anything like the kisses in novels. It was desperate and fierce and full of all the words neither of them knew how to say. Mara kissed him back with everything she had, pouring months of loneliness and fear and hope into that single moment. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Rhett rested his forehead against hers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he started. "We face it together," Mara finished. "That's what partners do." They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the quiet kitchen while the rest of the house slept and morning crept closer. For once, Mara wasn't thinking about her chair or her limitations or her lost teaching position. She was just existing in this moment with this complicated, damaged man who'd somehow become her home. Dawn came too fast. By 10 in the morning, people were gathering at the ranch. Families from across the valley, drawn by Marcus's message and their own curiosity about what Consolidated Western was really doing. By 11, there were at least 40 people in the yard, more than Mara had dared hope for. The children sat at the front, holding slates and looking serious. The women clustered together, forming a protective barrier. The men stood behind them, armed but not threatening, just visibly present. When the deputies arrived at noon, they found themselves facing something they clearly hadn't expected. A crowd of witnesses, all watching silently, all making it impossible for this arrest to happen quietly. The lead deputy, not Morrison, but an older man with a hard face, read the charges from horseback. "Rhett Mercer, you're under arrest for fraud, theft of company documents, and criminal conspiracy to interfere with lawful business operations." "Those charges are false," Rhett said calmly, "and everyone here knows it. That's for a judge to decide. Come peacefully, and this goes easy." "I'll come, but I want everyone here to see what's happening. Consolidated Western's arresting me because I exposed their illegal water rights theft. They're using law enforcement to silence opposition, and they're doing it in front of your children. The deputy's jaw tightened. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm making it honest. Rhett looked at the crowd. Remember this. Remember that standing up for what's right means paying a price, but staying silent costs more. They put him in manacles and loaded him into a wagon. The whole time, 40 people watched in silence. The children were crying. The women looked furious. The men's hands kept drifting toward weapons they didn't dare draw. As the wagon started rolling, Mara called out, "I'm coming too!" The deputy started to protest, but she cut him off. "That's my husband you're taking. I have a right to accompany him to town." They couldn't refuse without looking worse than they already did, so they allowed it. Mara's chair was loaded onto a second wagon, and she rode behind Rhett's wagon with Marcus driving, while the crowd followed at a distance. By the time they reached Red Hollow, half the town had turned out to watch. The arrest that was supposed to happen quietly had become a spectacle, exactly as Mara had planned. People lined the street, whispering behind their hands, watching with dawning understanding as Rhett Mercer was paraded through town like a criminal for the crime of fighting powerful men. They locked him in the town jail, a small building with 2 cells and a part-time marshal who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. Mara parked herself outside the jail's door and refused to move. "I'm staying right here," she announced to anyone who'd listen. "If they're going to kill my husband, they'll have to do it with me watching." The marshal tried to make her leave, but she wouldn't budge. Soon, other women joined her: Helen, Marcus's wife, a dozen others. They set up a vigil outside the jail, making it clear that nothing would happen to Rhett without witnesses. Inside, visible through the barred window, Rhett sat calmly on his cell's cot, looking almost peaceful despite the circumstances. He caught Mara's eye through the window and smiled, a real smile, full of pride and affection, and something that might have been hope. They turned his arrest into theater, made Consolidated's corruption visible, forced the Valley to choose sides. Now they just had to survive whatever came next. As the sun set on Red Hollow, Mara sat vigil outside the jail, with a growing crowd of women and children, all refusing to leave, all silently declaring that they would not let injustice happen in darkness. Somewhere in Denver, Elias Whitmore was probably realizing his tactical arrest had backfired spectacularly. And in that jail cell, Rhett Mercer sat waiting, not as a defeated criminal, but as a symbol of resistance that couldn't be quietly eliminated. The battle for Red Hollow's future had entered its next phase, and Mara Mercer, the woman the frontier had tried to forget, was leading the charge. The vigil outside the jail stretched into its second night. Mara's back ached from sitting in her chair for so long, and exhaustion pulled at her eyes like weights, but she refused to leave. Around her, the women took shifts, some sleeping in wagons parked nearby, others keeping watch, all maintaining the silent presence that said Rhett Mercer would not die alone in the darkness. Inside, through the barred window, Mara could see Rhett pacing his cell. The marshal had allowed her to speak with him briefly that first evening, 5 minutes of hurried conversation through iron bars while a deputy stood guard. "They're planning something," Rhett had told her quietly. "Kane visited an hour ago. Didn't say much, just stood outside the cell and smiled. That's worse than threats. We won't let them touch you. Mara, if they decide to move me, transport me to a territorial prison, or claim I need medical attention, you can't stop them. And once I'm away from witnesses, then we make sure you're never away from witnesses." Mara had gripped the bars separating them. "Trust me, I'm not the helpless teacher you married anymore." He'd almost smiled at that. "You were never helpless. I just didn't see it right away." Now, on the second night, the crowd had thinned slightly. People had farms to run, children to feed, lives that couldn't pause indefinitely. But a core group remained, maybe 15 women and twice as many men positioned strategically around the jail. Marcus had organized them into rotating watches, making sure someone was always paying attention. Around midnight, Mara heard horses, multiple riders, approaching from the south. She sat up straighter, her hand instinctively moving to the revolver Rhett had given her weeks ago. She barely knew how to use it, but the weight was comforting anyway. The riders resolved into Kane and 6 of his men, all armed. They stopped at the edge of the vigil, and Kane dismounted with deliberate slowness. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice carrying the false politeness of someone who'd already decided you were beneath them. "This protest of yours is getting tiresome. Your husband's been arrested legally. He'll receive a fair trial." "When?" Mara cut him off. "It's been 2 days and no trial date has been set. No lawyer allowed to see him. No formal charges read before a judge. That's not justice, Mr. Kane. That's kidnapping with a badge." Several of the watching women murmured agreement. Kane's jaw tightened. The legal process takes time, Mrs. Mercer. Your husband will receive all the protections afforded under territorial law. The same law that's allowed Consolidated Western to steal a dozen properties? The same law that ruled every suspicious fire and convenient death an accident? Mara rolled forward slightly, making Kane step back. We're not stupid, Mr. Kane. We know what you're doing. And we're making sure everyone else knows too. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Every hour Rhett sits in that cell without trial, more families see the truth. More people realize they're next if they don't stand together. Mara gestured to the women around her. You can arrest one man quietly, but you can't arrest all of us without making it obvious this valley's under occupation by corporate thugs. Kane's face flushed red. You're playing a dangerous game. No, we're refusing to play yours anymore. There's a difference. For a moment, Mara thought Kane might actually strike her. His hand moved toward his gun, and she saw several of the watching men shift, ready to intervene. But Kane caught himself, remembered where he was, who was watching. You've made your point, Mrs. Mercer. But points don't change outcomes. By week's end, your husband will be convicted and transported to a territorial prison. And this ranch of yours, this little refuge you've built, it'll be foreclosed on for back taxes you can't possibly pay. Then where will all these families go? Wherever they need to, but they'll go knowing they fought. That's more than most people in this valley can say. Kane stared at her for a long moment, then remounted his horse. You should have taken the money when we offered it. Would have been easier for everyone. Easier isn't the same as right. He rode off with his men, and Mara released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Her hands were shaking, adrenaline finally catching up to her, but she'd done it. She'd faced down Kane without flinching, without backing down. Helen appeared beside her with a blanket. That was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the stupidest. Probably both, Mara admitted, but he needed to know we're not giving up. He also now knows you're the real leader here, not Rhett. Helen's voice dropped. That makes you a target, Mara. I've been a target since I married Rhett. At least this way I'm choosing how to fight back. The night passed without further incident, but Mara couldn't shake the feeling that Kane's visit had been reconnaissance more than intimidation. He'd wanted to see their numbers, assess their determination, figure out the best way to break them. Dawn brought unexpected allies. Deputy Morrison returned, this time not in uniform but in plain clothes, leading 3 other men. They approached carefully, hands visible, making it clear they weren't a threat. Mrs. Mercer, Morrison said, these are deputies from neighboring counties. I told them what's happening here. They're willing to testify that the arrest was improper, that Consolidated's corrupted the local law enforcement. One of the other men, older with gray hair and a weathered face, stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm Deputy Marshal William Crawford from the Territorial Circuit. I can't override local jurisdiction, but I can file reports with the governor's office. If what Morrison says is true, if Consolidated's manipulating the legal system, that's a federal concern. Hope sparked in Mara's chest. Can you get Rhett released? Not immediately, but I can make sure he gets a real trial with impartial judges, and I can request federal oversight of Consolidated's operations in this valley. Crawford glanced at the jail. That won't happen overnight, but it's more protection than you have now. How long until federal authorities arrive? Week, maybe 2. Depends on how fast I can get the paperwork through. A week. It felt like an eternity when every hour Rhett sat in that cell brought him closer to whatever Kane was planning, but it was better than nothing. Thank you, Mara said. Whatever you can do, we're grateful. Crawford nodded and started toward the jail, presumably to inspect conditions and document irregularities. Morrison lingered behind. I'm sorry it's not more, he said quietly. I know federal help seems far away when you're fighting for your lives right now. It's more than we had yesterday. That's enough. Morrison left with Crawford, and Mara watched them disappear into the jail. Around her the vigil continued, women organizing food, men maintaining watch, children playing quiet games in the dirt. They'd created a small community here, bound together by shared fear and stubborn resistance. It reminded Mara of her classroom, back when she'd been teaching. That same sense of people coming together around something bigger than themselves, finding strength in collective purpose. The thought gave her an idea. Helen, she called, gather the children, all of them. Helen looked confused but complied. Within 10 minutes, the 5 children staying at the ranch plus several others whose families had joined the vigil stood before Mara in a small semicircle. We're having class, Mara announced. Thomas, The boy good with numbers raised his hand. Here? Outside the jail? Exactly here. Right now. Mara pulled out the slate she'd been carrying. We're going to learn about civic responsibility and peaceful resistance, about how ordinary people can hold powerful institutions accountable. She taught them for 2 hours, right there in the street, with Rhett watching from his cell window and the whole town gradually becoming aware that something unusual was happening. People stopped to listen. Some stood at a distance, curious despite themselves. Others, particularly younger folks who remembered Mara from her teaching days, came closer, asking questions, getting drawn into the lesson. By noon, Mara had an audience of 30 people listening as she explained how territorial law was supposed to work, how property rights functioned, what legal protections citizens theoretically had against corporate overreach. She made it simple, educational, stripped of rhetoric or accusation, just facts delivered in a teacher's calm voice. The marshal came out twice to tell her to move along, but each time he was met with such a large, attentive crowd that ordering them to disperse would have looked absurd. So he retreated back inside, clearly unsure how to handle a school teacher giving civics lessons in the middle of town. It was brilliant in its simplicity. Mara wasn't protesting or making speeches, she was teaching. And nobody could argue that education was a threat, except when the knowledge being shared exposed exactly how corrupt the system had become. That evening, as the lesson ended and families dispersed, a well-dressed woman approached Mara. She was in her 40s, expensive clothes marking her as someone with means, and her face was familiar, though Mara couldn't immediately place it. "Mrs. Mercer," the woman said, "I'm Catherine Brennan. My husband owns the general store." Mara remembered then. Thomas Brennan, who'd offered her that awful deal to work off her debt. His wife had always seemed uncomfortable with his more aggressive business tactics. "Mrs. Brennan," Mara said cautiously, "what can I do for you?" "It's what I can do for you, actually." Catherine glanced around, making sure no one was listening too closely. "My husband's been taking money from Consolidated. They pay him to report on who's buying what, who's struggling financially, who might be vulnerable to pressure. He doesn't know I know, but I've seen the ledgers." Mara's pulse quickened. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I heard you teaching today. Heard you explaining how the law is supposed to protect people, not corporations. And I realized I've been complicit in making this valley worse." Catherine's voice shook slightly. "I can't undo what my husband's done, but I can give you information. Names of other business owners taking Consolidated money, details about which families are being targeted next, meeting schedules between Kane and local officials." "That could be dangerous for you." "I know, but staying silent feels more dangerous somehow. For my soul, if nothing else." Catherine pressed a folded paper into Mara's hand. "That's everything I know. Use it however helps. And if you need somewhere safe to keep documents or send messages without your husband knowing, my sister runs a boarding house 2 towns over. She's trustworthy." Before Mara could respond, Catherine walked away quickly, disappearing into the evening crowd like she'd never been there. Mara unfolded the paper and scanned its contents, her eyes widening. Names, dates, dollar amounts. It was a roadmap of Consolidated's entire corruption network in Red Hollow. This was bigger than Rhett's stolen documents. This was testimony from inside the conspiracy itself. She needed to get this information to Deputy Crawford immediately, but the man had left town hours ago, and showing it to the local marshal was pointless. His name was on the list as receiving monthly payments from Consolidated. Mara made a decision. She found Marcus among the watching men. "I need you to ride," she said quietly, handing him the paper. "Take this to Deputy Marshal Crawford. Don't stop. Don't show it to anyone else. Just get it to him as fast as you can." Marcus scanned the paper and whistled low. "This is explosive, which is why it needs to reach someone who can actually use it. Go now, before anyone realizes what we have." Marcus left within the hour, riding hard toward the territorial capital. Mara watched him disappear into the darkness and prayed he'd make it safely. If Consolidated found out what Catherine had given them, she couldn't think about that. Had to focus on keeping Rhett alive and the vigil strong until federal help arrived. The third day brought a new crisis. The town council announced an emergency meeting to discuss public disturbances and unlawful assembly. Translation, they were going to try to break up the vigil through legal means, probably using some obscure town ordinance about loitering or disturbing the peace. Mara attended the meeting, rolling into the packed town hall with Helen and half a dozen other women. The council sat at a raised table, 5 men, all looking uncomfortable as they faced a room full of angry citizens. The mayor, a thin man named Porter who ran the local bank, called the meeting to order. "We're here to address the ongoing situation outside the jail," he began nervously. "While we understand people's concerns about Mr. Mercer's arrest, the current encampment is creating public safety issues. We're therefore invoking Town Ordinance 47, which prohibits camping within town limits for more than 48 hours without a permit." "Then give us a permit," Mara said immediately. Porter blinked. That's not... The ordinance doesn't allow for permits in this situation." "Why not? We're peaceful. We're not blocking commerce or creating hazards. We're simply exercising our right to witness our legal system in action." Mara's voice carried clearly through the room. "Unless the real problem isn't public safety, but public awareness of what's happening." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience. Porter looked to the other council members for support, but they were all avoiding his eyes. "The decision's been made," Porter said weakly. "The encampment must disperse by tomorrow morning or face fines and possible arrest for all participants." "Then arrest us," Helen spoke up. "Arrest every woman and child here. See how that looks to the territorial governor when federal investigators arrive next week." Porter's face went pale. "Federal investigators?" "Deputy Marshal Crawford's already filed reports with the governor's office," Mara said, exaggerating slightly. Crawford had promised to file reports, not that he'd actually done it yet. But the bluff worked. Consolidated Western's operations in this valley are under federal scrutiny now, and every action this council takes is being documented for those investigators. The room erupted into chaos, citizens shouting questions, council members arguing among themselves, Porter banging his gavel uselessly, trying to restore order. Finally, one of the other councilmen, a rancher named Davies, who'd been relatively quiet, stood up. "Mr. Mayor, I move we table enforcement of Ordinance 47 pending federal review of local governance. We don't want to take actions that might be seen as obstructing justice." "Second," another councilman said quickly. Porter looked like he wanted to argue, but the math was against him. The vote passed 4-1 with only Porter opposing. The vigil could continue. Mara left the meeting feeling cautiously triumphant, but also aware they'd made more enemies. Porter was clearly in Consolidated's pocket, and now he'd been publicly humiliated. Men like that didn't forget. She returned to find the vigil in turmoil. One of Helen's cousins had arrived with news. Kane's men had visited the ranch that morning, making threats, implying that empty properties were vulnerable to accidents. They'd also warned that any families harboring there would be held responsible for supporting criminal activities. "Half the families packed up and left," Helen told Mara, her voice tight with frustration. "They're scared. Can't really blame them." "How many stayed?" "4 families, plus the grandmother who says she's too mean to run." 4 families. Out of the dozen they'd had just days ago. The resistance was fracturing under sustained pressure, exactly as Kane had intended. Mara felt despair threatening, but pushed it back. 4 families was still 4 more than 0. Still enough to matter. That night, unable to sleep, Mara was sitting outside the jail when she heard a sound from Rhett's cell. Not distress, just movement. She rolled closer to the barred window. "You awake?" she called softly. "Can't sleep. Keeps getting interrupted by this impressive woman causing trouble all over town." Mara smiled despite everything. "I learned from a stubborn man I know. He sounds smart. He's an idiot who got himself arrested." But her voice was fond rather than angry. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I should be, knowing you're out there fighting." Rhett's face appeared at the window, shadows making it hard to read his expression. "You've done more in 3 days than I managed in months, Mara. You've turned this from my personal revenge into an actual movement. I just did what needed doing." "No. You did what I wasn't capable of. You made people believe change was possible. I was just angry. You're actually strategic." He reached through the bars and Mara gripped his fingers. "Whatever happens, I need you to know. I don't regret any of this. Not the marriage, not the fight, not even getting arrested. Because it meant finding you." Mara's throat tightened. "Don't talk like you're dying. I'm not planning to, but if Kane gets creative, he won't. I won't let him." She squeezed his hand harder. "You're going to get out of here, Rhett. We're going to win this fight, and then we're going to build the life we should have had from the start." "What kind of life?" "One where we don't have to pretend our marriage is just business. One where I wake up beside you because I want to, not because strategy requires it." Mara's voice dropped. "One where we're partners in everything, not just survival." Rhett was quiet for a moment. I'd like that. Then stay alive long enough to have it. They talked for another hour about nothing and everything. The ranch, the school Mara wanted to rebuild, the future of Red Hollow, once consolidated, was defeated. It was planning for a tomorrow that might never come, but somehow that made it more precious. The fourth day brought the confrontation everyone had been dreading. Kane arrived mid-morning with a dozen armed men and a new warrant, this one ordering Rhett's immediate transfer to a territorial prison 3 days' ride away. The official justification was concerns about local unrest and prisoner safety, but everyone knew what it really meant. Once Rhett was isolated, away from witnesses, he'd never survive the journey. "You can't do this," Mara said, positioning herself between Kane's men and the jail entrance. "Deputy Marshal Crawford has requested Rhett remain here pending federal investigation." "Crawford has no jurisdiction over criminal transport," Kane interrupted. "This warrant is properly filed and legally binding. Mr. Mercer will be moved today." "Over my dead body." "That can be arranged, Mrs. Mercer." The threat hung in the air, and suddenly the street was very quiet. The women of the vigil moved closer, forming a human barrier around the jail door. The men who'd been watching moved forward too, hands near weapons, but not drawing them. Kane's men shifted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the idea of shooting their way through women and children to reach one prisoner. "Stand aside," Kane ordered. "This is lawful authority." "This is murder with paperwork," Mara shot back, "and everyone here knows it. You move Rhett from this jail, he'll be dead within 24 hours. Convenient accident on the road. Prisoner tried to escape. Whatever lie you've already prepared. You're making serious accusations without evidence. I'm stating the obvious. And I'm telling you right now, you're not taking him. Not today, not ever. You want him, you'll have to go through all of us first." Kane's face twisted with rage. "You stupid cripple. You think your chair makes you special, makes you untouchable? I will drag you out of that chair and—" He didn't finish. Rhett's voice came from inside the jail, low and dangerous. "Touch my wife, and I will kill you, Kane. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but I will hunt you down, and I will end you." That's not a threat, that's a certainty. The conviction in Rhett's voice made several of Kane's men actually step back. Even Kane seemed to reconsider, some survival instinct warning him that this particular line shouldn't be crossed. But before anyone could move, a new sound cut through the tension. Horses, lots of them, approaching fast from the east. Everyone turned to see a group of riders in federal uniforms, led by Deputy Marshal Crawford and, impossibly, Marcus Webb. Crawford dismounted and walked directly to Kane, his hand on his sidearm. "Mr. Kane, I'm placing you under temporary restraint pending investigation of corruption charges. You're not to leave Red Hollow or interfere with any witnesses until federal prosecutors arrive." Kane's face went white, then red. "On what grounds?" "On grounds of documented bribes to local officials, conspiracy to manipulate property records, and possible involvement in several suspicious deaths." Crawford pulled out the paper Catherine Brennan had provided. Marcus must have ridden like hell to get it to him and bring help back so fast. "We have testimony from multiple sources, including some inside Consolidated Western itself. Your operations in this valley are now under federal investigation." "This is outrageous. Consolidated Western has lawyers. Then they'll need them. My authority supersedes local warrants." Crawford turned to the marshal. "Release Rhett Mercer immediately. He's to remain in Red Hollow under house arrest until trial, but in his own home with his wife." The marshal looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find grounds. Within minutes, Rhett was walking out of that jail cell, blinking in the afternoon sunlight, free for the first time in 4 days. Mara rolled toward him and he dropped to his knees, pulling her into a fierce embrace. Around them, the vigil erupted into cheers and tears. But Mara barely heard it, focused entirely on the man in her arms, alive and safe and real. "Told you I wouldn't let them take you," she whispered. "I should have believed you from the start." They pulled apart, and Rhett helped her back into her chair, his hands gentle despite their roughness. Crawford approached, his expression serious. "This isn't over," he told them. "Consolidated's going to fight these charges hard. But that paper you gave Marcus, that changes everything. If even half of what's documented there holds up, we're looking at federal charges against multiple company executives." "What about the families?" Mara asked. "The ones being threatened, losing their homes?" "Federal prosecutors will review every foreclosure Consolidated's conducted in this valley. If we can prove fraud or coercion, those seizures could be reversed." Crawford glanced at Kane, who was being detained by 2 federal deputies. It'll take time, but you've bought yourselves that time. It was more than Mara had dared hope for. Not victory, not yet, but the possibility of victory. The chance for justice instead of just survival. As they prepared to return to the ranch, surrounded by families who'd stood with them through 4 impossible days, Mara caught sight of Catherine Brennan watching from across the street. The woman nodded once, then disappeared back into her store. One brave choice, Mara thought. That's all it took to change everything. One person deciding their conscience mattered more than their safety. The ride back to the ranch felt different than any journey Mara had taken in months. Rhett sat beside her in the wagon, his hand covering hers, and for the first time since that morning in her cabin when he'd proposed this impossible marriage, Mara felt like they were traveling towards something rather than away from it. The ranch, when they arrived, looked almost peaceful in the afternoon light. The families who'd remained rushed out to greet them, and even the grandmother managed something close to a smile. "Knew you'd bring him back," the old woman said. "You're too stubborn to fail." That night, after everyone had eaten and the children were asleep, and the ranch had finally settled into quiet, Mara and Rhett sat on their porch watching the stars. "We're going to have to testify," Rhett said eventually. "Federal prosecutors will want everything we know about Consolidated's operations." "I know. It'll be dangerous. They'll try to discredit us, maybe worse." "I know that too." Mara looked at him. "But we're still doing it, because some fights matter more than safety." Rhett pulled her close, and they sat like that for a long time. Two people who'd started as strangers in a marriage of convenience and somehow become partners in something far more important. The fight for Red Hollow wasn't over. The trials would be brutal, the resistance would face more threats, and victory was still far from guaranteed. But they'd proven something crucial, that ordinary people could stand against power and survive. The teachers and ranchers and frightened families could become an army when they stopped accepting injustice as inevitable. And for Mara Mercer, who'd once thought her life had ended in a wagon accident, that knowledge felt like resurrection. She'd survived losing her legs. She'd survived losing her teaching position. She'd survived a marriage that was supposed to be a trap. And now she'd survived 4 days of standing between armed men and the person she loved, refusing to let power win through fear alone. Whatever came next, she was ready for it. Because the frontier hadn't forgotten her after all. It had been waiting for her to remember who she really was. The peace lasted exactly 6 days. Federal investigators arrived on a Tuesday, 3 stern men in suits who set up temporary offices in Red Hollow's town hall and began interviewing everyone connected to Consolidated Western's operations. Mara and Rhett spent hours providing testimony, walking prosecutors through documents, explaining the patterns of intimidation and fraud that had poisoned the valley for years. It felt like progress, like justice might actually happen. Then on Monday morning, 7-year-old Thomas didn't show up for lessons. Mara noticed immediately. The boy never missed class, loved learning too much to skip even when he was sick. When Helen arrived without him, her face was pale and her hands were shaking. "They took him," Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kane's men. Left a note saying if we want him back, Rhett needs to recant his testimony and you need to tell the federal investigators you lied about everything." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Mara gripped her chair's wheels hard enough to hurt, trying to process what she was hearing. They'd taken a child, actually kidnapped a 7-year-old boy to use as leverage. Rhett was already moving, grabbing his rifle, his face a mask of cold fury. "Where?" "The note said they're at your father's old ranch. The one Consolidated took. Said they'll wait there until tomorrow at noon, and if you don't show up alone and unarmed with signed recantations, we'll never see Thomas again." "It's a trap," Marcus said immediately. "They're going to kill you both the second you show up." "Probably," Rhett agreed, "but we're going anyway." "No," Mara's voice cut through the rising panic. "We're not walking into an ambush. We're doing this differently." Everyone turned to look at her. Mara's mind was racing, sorting through options, discarding the ones that got people killed, trying to find the thread that led to Thomas coming home alive. "They want us desperate," she said slowly. "Want us to react emotionally instead of strategically. That's their advantage. They think we'll sacrifice everything for one child." "We will," Helen said, tears streaming down her face. "He's my nephew, Mara. I can't just—" "I'm not saying we abandon him. I'm saying we don't give Kane what he wants." Mara looked at Rhett. "Your father's ranch, you know the layout. Every inch. I grew up there. Then we use that. We don't go in unarmed and helpless. We go in prepared with backup, and we make Kane understand that threatening children was the worst mistake he could have made. Over the next hour, they planned. Rhett drew maps of the ranch, marking buildings, sight lines, places where people could hide. Marcus volunteered to ride for Deputy Marshal Crawford, bring federal law enforcement into this before it turned into vigilante justice. The other men prepared weapons and horses. Mara focused on the one thing she understood better than anyone: teaching. Thomas is smart, she told Helen. Smarter than Kane probably realizes. If we can get him information, he'll know what to do with it. How do we get information to a kidnapped child? We don't. We make sure he already has it. Mara called the other children over. Did Thomas have his slate with him when he was taken? Jacob, the older boy, nodded. He never goes anywhere without it, always practicing his numbers. Good. Then he has a way to communicate. Mara turned to Helen. I taught them a simple code last month, basic alphabet substitution. If Thomas can mark his slate and get it visible somehow through a window, even just for a moment, we might be able to get information about where he is in the building, how many guards. It was a desperate plan, dependent on a terrified 7-year-old remembering lessons and staying calm enough to use them. But it was better than nothing. They rode out at first light, Rhett, Mara, Marcus, and 4 other men who'd proven themselves during the vigil. Deputy Crawford had sent word he was coming with federal deputies, but they wouldn't arrive until that afternoon. By then, it might be too late. The old Mercer Ranch sat in a valley 5 miles north, surrounded by brown hills and dying grass. It had been beautiful once, Rhett told her quietly as they approached. His father had built it from nothing, raised cattle there, planned to pass it down through generations. Now it was just another piece of consolidated stolen empire. They stopped half a mile out, using the hills for cover. Rhett studied the ranch through a borrowed spyglass, his jaw tight. 3 men visible outside, probably more inside. They're positioned like they're expecting trouble but not serious resistance, overconfident. He handed the spyglass to Marcus. Main house has Thomas, most likely. That's where my father's office was. Only room with a lock strong enough to hold a prisoner. Can you get close without being seen? There's a creek bed that runs behind the barn. Covered approach gets you within 50 yards of the main house. Rhett looked at Mara. You should stay here. This is going to get dangerous. No, I'm coming. Mara. That boy is my student. My responsibility. And if Kane's there, if this turns into a standoff, you'll need me. I'm the one who's been talking to federal investigators. The one whose testimony carries weight. Kane knows killing me means federal charges become unavoidable. She met his eyes steadily. I'm your insurance policy. And Thomas deserves to see a familiar face when we get him out. Rhett looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find solid ground. Finally, he nodded. They approached using the creek bed, Mara's chair navigating the rough terrain with difficulty but managing. The other men spread out, taking positions in the hills with rifles, ready to provide covering fire if needed. As they drew closer, Mara caught sight of something that made her breath catch. A small slate propped in a second-floor window, visible for just a moment before being pulled back inside. There, she whispered, pointing. Thomas is signaling. Rhett raised the spyglass, studying the window. Can you read what he marked? Mara squinted, trying to make out the scratches on the slate. It's his code. Give me a second. She mentally translated, her heart pounding. 3 men, 1 door, window locked. Smart kid, Marcus muttered. Brilliant kid, Mara corrected. He's telling us exactly what we need to know. They watched for another 10 minutes, mapping guard rotations, looking for weaknesses. Then Rhett made his decision. Marcus, you and the others provide distraction from the east side. Make noise, make them think that's where the attack's coming from. I'll use the confusion to get inside through the kitchen. Door's never locked right. I can force it. Mara, you stay at the creek bed until I signal it's safe. What's the signal? You'll know it when you see it. Before Mara could protest, Rhett was moving, using the barn for cover, disappearing toward the back of the house. Marcus and the others began their distraction, shouting, firing shots into the air, creating chaos that pulled the outside guards away from the main house. Mara sat in the creek bed, her heart hammering, watching the ranch and praying this desperate plan would work. Minutes felt like hours. Then she heard it, glass breaking, shouting from inside the house, a gunshot that made her flinch. Then silence. Terrible, complete silence. Mara couldn't wait anymore. She rolled toward the house, using what cover she could find, her hands slipping on the wheels from sweat and fear. She was halfway across the open ground, when the front door burst open and Kane stumbled out, dragging Thomas in front of him like a shield, a gun pressed to the boy's head. "Stop right there," Kane shouted, and everyone froze. "I see those rifles in the hills. Tell them to back off or this kid dies." Thomas was crying but trying to stay brave, and Mara felt rage unlike anything she'd ever experienced. This man had threatened families, burned homes, corrupted an entire valley's government. But using a child as a human shield crossed a line that went beyond strategy or business. "Let him go, Kane," Mara called, rolling forward slowly. "This is over. Federal deputies are minutes away. You kill that boy, you'll hang for it." "I'll hang anyway, thanks to you and your husband." Kane's face was twisted with desperate fury. Everything Consolidated built here, destroyed because some crippled teacher couldn't mind her own business. No, destroyed because you thought power made you untouchable. Mara kept rolling forward, getting closer despite the gun. You could have competed fairly, could have built something legitimate. Instead, you chose fear and corruption. That was your choice, Kane, not mine. Shut up. Just shut up. Kane's hand was shaking, the gun wavering against Thomas's head. "Where's Mercer? Where's your husband?" "Right behind you," Rhett's voice said calmly. Kane spun, and in that moment of distraction, Thomas did something remarkable. He went completely limp, dropping his weight so suddenly that Kane's grip slipped. The boy hit the ground and rolled away, and suddenly Kane was standing alone with his gun raised and Rhett facing him with his own weapon drawn. "Drop it," Rhett said. "You drop yours." "Not happening. You're finished, Kane. Even if you kill me, those federal deputies will be here within the hour. Catherine Brennan's testimony alone is enough to put you away for decades. You've lost." Kane's eyes darted around, looking for escape routes, finding none. The men in the hills had their rifles trained on him. Thomas had scrambled to safety behind Mara's chair. There was no way out. "You destroyed everything," Kane said, and he sounded almost bewildered. Consolidated Western was supposed to develop this territory, bring civilization and order. We were doing important work. "You were stealing from people who couldn't fight back," Mara said. "That's not civilization. That's just theft dressed up in legal language. You don't understand how the world works. Resources belong to whoever's strong enough to claim them. That's always been the law of the frontier." "No," Mara said firmly. "That's the law of bullies and cowards. The real frontier, the one worth building, belongs to people who work together, who share resources instead of hoarding them, who protect the vulnerable instead of exploiting them. You failed because you never understood that." For a moment, Kane just stared at her. This woman in a chair who'd somehow dismantled his entire operation through nothing but stubborn refusal to be intimidated. Then, slowly, he lowered his gun. "I should have killed you that first day," he said bitterly. "Should have burned that cabin with you in it." "Probably," Mara agreed. "But you didn't. And that's the difference between us. You only know how to destroy. I know how to build." Rhett moved forward and disarmed Kane while Marcus and the others came down from the hills. By the time Deputy Marshal Crawford arrived with federal deputies an hour later, Kane was tied up and Thomas was safe in his aunt's arms, crying but unhurt. The trials took 3 months. Mara testified 5 separate times, walking federal prosecutors through every detail of Consolidated Western's corruption network. Catherine Brennan testified too, despite threats from her husband. Deputy Morrison provided evidence of falsified reports and manipulated investigations. One by one, the pieces of Consolidated's empire crumbled under federal scrutiny. Elias Whitmore and 2 other executives were convicted of fraud and conspiracy. Kane received 20 years for kidnapping and attempted murder. The territorial governor, facing his own investigation, resigned in disgrace. And most importantly, every property Consolidated had seized through fraudulent means was returned to its original owners, or their heirs. Rhett's father's ranch came back to him on a cold December morning. Mara rode out with him to see it, watching his face as he walked through rooms he'd thought he'd lost forever. "It's smaller than I remembered," he said quietly, standing in what had been his childhood bedroom. "Or maybe I'm just bigger now. What matters is it's yours again." "Ours," Rhett corrected. "Everything I have is ours, Mara. That's not legal obligation anymore, that's choice." They'd had the marriage contract rewritten the previous month, removing all the clauses about separate property and strategic arrangements. Now it was just a marriage, simple and real, built on partnership that had been tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. "What do you want to do with it?" Mara asked. "The ranch, I mean." Rhett was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the land his father had loved. "I keep thinking about those families who stood with us. Helen and her kids, Marcus, all the others who lost their homes to Consolidated, they need somewhere stable, somewhere they can rebuild. You want to turn it into a cooperative? Something like that. Shared land, shared resources, everyone working together instead of competing. Make it proof that the frontier doesn't have to be about who's strongest or most ruthless. He looked at her. Think that's naive? I think it's exactly right. Mara smiled. And I think we should put the school here too. Central location, room for families to settle nearby, access to the water system we fought so hard to protect. Make this place what your father would have wanted, a real community. They spent the winter planning, and by spring the transformation was underway. 5 families settled on the old Mercer Ranch, each with their own homestead but sharing equipment, labor, and resources. Rhett taught them the water management techniques his father had developed, showing how the underground system could support sustainable farming even in drought years. Mara built her school, not just a room this time, but an actual building with windows that caught the morning light and enough space for 30 students. Families came from across the valley, some traveling hours each way so their children could learn from the teacher who'd stood up to Consolidated Western and won. Teaching again felt like coming home. Every morning, Mara rang the school bell and watched children stream in, eager and curious and full of potential. She taught them reading and arithmetic, history and science. But she also taught them about civic responsibility, about how ordinary people could hold power accountable, about the difference between law and justice. Remember, she told them frequently, nobody's going to save you. Not the government, not wealthy benefactors, not heroes riding in from somewhere else. You save yourselves by standing together and refusing to accept injustice as inevitable. Thomas, now 8 and thriving, became her unofficial teaching assistant. The kidnapping had left marks. He still had nightmares sometimes, still flinched at sudden noises, but he was also stronger for it, more certain of his own courage. Mrs. Mercer, he asked one afternoon while helping clean chalkboards, why did you keep fighting, even when it was dangerous, even when you could have just taken Mr. Kane's money and left? Mara considered the question carefully. Because some things matter more than safety, Thomas. My dignity mattered more than money. The truth mattered more than convenience. And the kind of valley we were building, one where people like you could grow up free and educated and full of possibilities, that mattered more than my fear. Were you scared? Terrified. Every single day. But you did it anyway. That's what courage is. Not the absence of fear, but deciding that something else matters more. Mara looked at the boy who'd been brave enough to signal from a window while kidnapped, brave enough to drop his weight at exactly the right moment. You know about that already. You proved it. Thomas ducked his head, embarrassed but pleased. By summer, Red Hollow had transformed. The cooperative ranch was thriving, producing enough food to support 3 times as many families as Consolidated had managed with their exploitative system. The school had 40 students, and Mara had hired Sarah Carson, her replacement from before, as a second teacher. Turned out Sarah was perfectly competent and deeply relieved to share the workload with someone who actually knew these families. The underground water system, once fought over by wealthy speculators, became communally managed. Every property owner with access had a voice in decisions about usage and conservation. It wasn't perfect, people still argued, still had competing interests, but it was fair in a way Consolidated's control never could have been. The town itself slowly changed too. Porter lost his position as mayor, replaced by Davies, the rancher who'd stood up during that crucial council vote. Catherine Brennan left her husband and opened a small lending library, providing books to families who'd never had access to reading material before. Deputy Morrison became the new marshal, rebuilding law enforcement around actual justice instead of corporate interests. It wasn't a miracle transformation. Problems didn't disappear just because the villain had been defeated. People still struggled with drought, with poverty, with the 100 daily challenges of frontier life. But they struggled together now, in a system they'd built themselves rather than one imposed from above. Mara and Rhett's marriage deepened into something neither of them had expected to find. They learned each other's rhythms, the way Rhett went quiet when he was processing emotions, how Mara needed space after particularly hard teaching days. They fought sometimes, usually about stupid things like whether the barn needed repairs immediately or could wait until spring. But they also laughed together, planned together, built a life together that felt earned rather than arranged. One evening, in late autumn, sitting on their porch watching the sun set over the valley, Rhett asked the question that had been hovering between them for months. Do you ever regret it, saying yes when I proposed? Mara thought about that morning at her cabin, about the desperate woman she'd been, willing to accept anything to avoid losing her home. Thought about everything that had followed, the fear and danger and impossibility of fighting Consolidated Western. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it had to be that hard, that we had to risk so much, that people got hurt, that a child was kidnapped because of choices we made. But I don't regret choosing to fight. Don't regret choosing you. Even though I lied at the start, used you? You were honest about using me. That's different from lying." Mara took his hand. "And somewhere along the way, you stopped using me and started partnering with me. That's what matters." Rhett pulled her closer, and they sat watching the valley settle into darkness. In the distance, Mara could see lights from the cooperative farms, smoke rising from chimneys, signs of life rebuilding itself after years of corporate exploitation. "I keep thinking about my father," Rhett said eventually, "wondering what he'd make of all this, the cooperative, the school, the way we restructured the water rights. He'd be proud, maybe, or maybe he'd think I was naive, that systems like this can't last, that eventually someone stronger will come along and take it all again. Then we'll fight them too." Mara's voice was certain. "That's the thing about building something worth protecting. You have to keep protecting it. Every generation, every day. There's no final victory, Rhett, just the choice to keep choosing justice over convenience." It was a harder truth than fairy tales allowed, but it was real. The frontier they were building together wouldn't stay safe on its own. It required constant work, constant vigilance, constant willingness to stand up when power tried to concentrate itself in the wrong hands. But that was okay, because they'd proven it was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. The school bell rang each morning now, calling children to learn not just reading and arithmetic, but how to think critically, how to question authority, how to build the world they wanted instead of accepting the one handed to them. The cooperative farms produced food and taught people that shared resources created more abundance than hoarded ones. The community water system demonstrated that common goods could be managed collectively without tragedy. None of it was perfect. All of it required constant effort. But it was theirs, built by ordinary people who'd decided that dignity mattered more than safety, that community mattered more than profit, that the frontier's future belonged to those brave enough to imagine something better. On the first anniversary of Rhett's arrest, Mara organized a celebration at the school. Families came from across the valley, bringing food and stories, gathering to remember the fight they'd won and commit to the work ahead. Helen's family was there, Thomas laughing with the other children, no longer haunted by his kidnapping. Marcus brought his wife and new baby, born just weeks earlier. The grandmother presided over everything like a benevolent dictator, making sure everyone ate and no one got too drunk on the homemade whiskey someone had contributed. As the sun set and people began dancing to fiddle music, Mara found herself surrounded by students and their families, all wanting to thank her for teaching their children, for fighting for the valley, for refusing to accept defeat. "You saved us," one mother said, eyes shining with tears. But Mara shook her head. "No, we saved ourselves. I just refused to do it quietly." Because that was the truth, the lesson she'd learned through every impossible moment of the past year. Nobody saved you. You saved yourself, and then you saved your neighbors. And together you built something that made salvation obsolete, because you'd created a world where people didn't need saving in the first place. Later, as the celebration wound down and families headed home under a sky full of stars, Mara and Rhett stood together watching their community disperse. "Think we'll ever get to rest?" Rhett asked. "Probably not. There's always another fight." Mara smiled. "But at least we get to choose our fights now. That's its own kind of freedom." "I love you," Rhett said, the words still slightly awkward in his mouth, but sincere. "In case I haven't said that recently." "You haven't. I love you too." Mara leaned against him. "Even though you're still terrible at expressing emotions, and you never remember to fix the porch step I've asked about 6 times. I'll fix it tomorrow." "You said that last week." "This time I mean it." They both knew he probably wouldn't, just like Mara knew she'd probably remind him again next week, and they'd have this same circular conversation that was less about the porch step and more about the comfortable rhythm of a real marriage. The frontier had tried to forget Mara Holloway, had stripped away her legs, her job, her future, had left her to disappear into charity and obscurity. Instead, she'd married a dangerous stranger, fought a corporate empire, turned a marriage of convenience into a real partnership, and built a school that would teach generations of children that power belonged to people who refused to surrender it. She'd saved herself. Then she'd saved her valley, not through miracles or perfect victories, but through stubborn refusal to accept that the world couldn't be better than it was. And every morning, when she rang that school bell and watched children stream toward knowledge and possibility, Mara understood something profound. The frontier didn't need saving. It needed people brave enough to build the future they wanted instead of accepting the one they'd been handed. She was one of those people now. Not perfect, not without scars, not free from fear or doubt, just willing to fight, willing to build, willing to believe that ordinary people standing together could change everything. That was enough. It would always be enough. The bell rang again, calling the valley toward tomorrow, and Mara Mercer, teacher, fighter, partner, survivor, answered with the certainty of someone who'd learned that the only story worth living was the one you wrote yourself, even if it terrified you. Especially if it terrified you. Because fear meant you were doing something that mattered, and mattering in the end was all any of them really wanted.